include The Other Self, Selfhood and Society in Modern Greek Fiction, a series of edited volumes on Greek modernism and beyond, Greece and the Balkans, Identities, Perceptions, and Cultural Encounters since the Enlightenment, Greek Diaspora and Migration, Reimagining the Past, Antiquity and Modern Greek Culture, Greece in Crisis, Culture and the Politics of Austerity. These two are more recent, 2014 and 2017, respectively. Now he's working on a 2-year research project funded by the Leverhulme Trust. Also, I should mention in a sort of more private note that I got to know his work before I met him, because his work was and remains essential for anyone who wants to study the interwar years of Greek culture. Greece in the interwar years, what we call the generation of the 1930s, a collective of poets and critics and who sort of shaped the way Greece sees itself even to the present day. So his little book, it's a very small book, but rather concise. So his little book, it was compulsory reading for anyone wanting to understand Greece of that period. So it is a great pleasure for me that Dimitris is here today. So we're all familiar with our format. We start with a sort of 40-45-minute presentation on behalf of our speaker, and then we have an open discussion. Oh, sorry. Then we have a break, which is something I always forget. Then we take a short break, and then we have a discussion of another 40-45 minutes on the topic. So Dimitris' first lecture, because of course he's giving one tomorrow as well. His first lecture is The Parthenon and the Politics of Heritage, from Eternal Glory to
Thank you, Dimitris, for your kind introduction, and also the organizers for the invitation to this interdisciplinary meeting. As you probably know by now, and thanks to the introduction by Dimitris, is that I'm not an archaeologist, I'm more of a cultural historian. In this way, I will approach the story of the Parthenon. Just to share my screen. Right, I'll start with a general introduction before I move to the discussion of the Parthenon. A nation or a country can be judged by the way it engages with its past and its memories. Due to its widely acclaimed ancient culture, which has been much debated over the years and has been seen alternately as an asset and a burden, Greece has been at the forefront of such efforts to come to terms with its past. Excuse my hoarse voice. Taking the former view, for instance, an American anthropologist has claimed, I quote, Greece is unusual in having a past that is almost as highly valued internationally as it is nationally. With regard to the less positive view of a Greek historian, has argued that from George Finlay to Toynbee and from Toynbee to Romilly Jenkins and Cyril Mango, the last two were Byzantinists, the Greeks had been measured against constructs of the past and found wanting in qualities associated with either classical Greece or Byzantium. Can we move beyond these two dominant perspectives on the Greek past by shifting attention to the ways this past has been constructed, performed, and reimagined? By reimagining the Greek past, I do not simply mean devising a new set of questions and exploring the hierarchical tensions relating to its various periods and aspects. This could also question the dubious logic adopted by some Western intellectuals and scholars who conjured up their own Hellas, though some of them had never ever visited the country. Their attitude is aptly summed up by a writer who actually visited Greece. In an early diary entry from her trip to Greece in 1906, Virginia Woolf separates the past and present of the country in this way. I take some pains to put old Greece on my right hand and new Greece on my left, and nothing that I say of the one shall apply to the other. Reimagining the past is an opportunity to critically examine and engage imaginatively with various approaches to the ancient past and its monuments. Starting from the premise that, as has customarily been said, the Greeks are trapped in and by their past, then reimagining that past could be seen as an act of liberation and a forward-looking gesture, an invitation to look at different uses and articulations of the past, both in and outside Greece, which can range from literature to education and from politics to cinema. Antiquity has often been perceived as the source of Greece's modern achievements, as well as its frustrations, with a continuity between ancient and modern Greek culture and the legacy of classical Greece to Europe dominating and shaping current perceptions of the classical past. What allowed the educated Greeks to see themselves as distinct from the rest of the Balkan populations under Ottoman rule or other members of the Christian Orthodox Millet Irum was their classical past, which gave them the sense of a privileged relationship with Europe. On the one hand, the Greeks themselves were divided between seeking a return to their ancient past and fighting for inclusion in the European modernity. And on the other hand, the Europeans' claims on Greece lay in their knowledge of its past. The lauded relationship between the ancient ruins, the Hellenic topos, and the European logos about them has offered scholars the opportunity to study Greece as a culture of ruins. And the place of Greek monuments in the popular or global imagination have both received a great deal of attention in the context of cultural memory studies. In particular, the successive transformations of the Parthenon from temple to church and mosque, or from a ruin to a monument, suggest that the focus is no longer exclusively on its classical glory, but also on its reinvention across the ages. The purging of post-classical structures, or the remains of barbarity in inverted commas from the Acropolis, has been seen as symbolic of the effacement of Greece's medieval and post-medieval history and culture, and of a blind preoccupation with a classical ideal. So you could see on the PowerPoint different views of the Acropolis in different periods. And in this drawing by William Pars, you could see inside the Parthenon a church or a mosque, as we'll see later on in my presentation. The growing scholarly and public awareness that the Acropolis as a modern space, discussively and institutionally constructed, has a history beyond its classical splendor, has also fueled criticism of the new Acropolis Museum for ignoring that fact, and led to support a public campaign to prevent the demolition of two nearby listed buildings, which obscured the museum's visitor view of the Acropolis. Here you could see the two listed buildings on the left, and with the help of the Photoshop, I have removed the two buildings in the way that a number of people have wanted not to have a kind of unobstructed view between the museum and the Acropolis and the Parthenon. The Parthenon of the 21st century is as much the construct of the archaeologist as it is of Pericles and his builders. The stripping of later accretions from the Acropolis had the opposite effect of what was intended. In their attempt to reestablish direct contact with the classical past by removing the Christian and Muslim additions that cluttered the Parthenon, the classicizers succeeded in destroying the very features that embodied the historical continuity of the buildings used as pagan sanctuary, church and mosque. The stripping of the Parthenon is symbolic of the effacement of Greece's medieval and post-medieval history and culture. Although there is a claim for continuity, in the case of the Parthenon, this continuity is broken down or ignored. In this way, the Parthenon, like Greek language, culture, and identity, has come to be seen by Greeks in a historical way, as something eternal and unchanging. Having been captured by the Greeks in 1822, the Acropolis was handed over to the Turks again in 1827, after a siege in which a huge amount of damage was done to the buildings. After the last Ottoman garrison was expelled from the Acropolis in 1833, efforts were made to strip the Acropolis, and especially the Parthenon, of all the accretions that had encrusted it since classical times. During the restoration works, the small Ismadi Mosque, built inside the ruined Parthenon after the explosion of 1687, together with a projecting part of the older minaret, was removed in 1842. Part of the wall of the Byzantine apse was removed in 1862. When it was converted into a church, the apse had to, the entrance and the apse had to change direction from towards the east, and that's why they brought down part of the metopy, as you could see at the bottom of the slide. In 1836, the Temple of Victory, demolished in 1686 by the Ottomans for building material which they used for fortification, was re-erected by Ludwig Ross, first director of the Greek Archaeological Service. You could see the temple at the top. Later in 1874, the Florentine Tower, which you could see at the bottom of the slide, behind the restored Temple of Victory, was demolished at the expense of Heinrich Schliemann. In this way, the Acropolis was cleared of the remains of barbarity, as von Klenz called them in 1834. Von Klenz obviously was a Bavarian, part of the Bavarian entourage, which ruled Greece in the early years of independence. In 1834, the Parthenon was declared an ancient monument, and during the 1830s and 1840s, the Acropolis was cleared of unwanted constructions at the instigation of Leon von Klenz, chief architect to King Ludwig I of Bavaria, and briefly town planning advisor to the government of Ludwig's son, King Otto of Greece. You could see that even there were houses, Turkish house to the east of the ARCHAEON, as you could see on the slide. This kind of cleansing continued in the 20th century, and in the 1920s and the 1930s, the columns of the north side of the Parthenon, which had been scattered by the explosion of 1687, were restored to their original positions by the Greek engineer Nikolaos Balanos, who had been in charge of the restoration of the Parthenon since 1895. The result of what the classicist Mary Beard has called archaeological cleansing is that almost all the traces of the Christian, Byzantine, and Muslim Ottoman history of the Acropolis have been removed. The Byzantinist Anthony Breyer has claimed that the removal of post-classical accretions from the Acropolis represented, I quote, a destruction more devastating than the sieges of 1822 and of 1826-27, let alone Lord Elgin's. Even the Byzantine frescoes inside the Parthenon, which the British traveler Robert Carson saw them in 1833-1834 and described as, quote, of considerable antiquity and beautifully done, were allowed to fade into almost complete invisibility. We should bear in mind that the transformation of the Acropolis began at a time when the Byzantine heritage of the Greeks had yet to be explored and exploited. The Christian remains were not allowed to stand in the way of the classical heritage. which was considered to be of greater importance. And here, for those who are interested, I can recommend the book by Anthony Caldelis, professor of Byzantine history at Ohio State University, The Christian Parthenon. Thus, the Acropolis was purified in the same way as an attempt was made to Hellenize the Greek collective consciousness, and through kathareusa, the purifying language, to purify the modern Greek language. Since the early 19th century, the Parthenon has been through successive physical and symbolic metamorphoses. It entered the independent Greek state as the housing for a mosque. Next, it became a museum, stripped of its post-classical construction and incrustations. At that time, even though it was no longer living, it could nevertheless still be penetrated, excuse me, explored, walked in, walked over, walked through. In recent years, however, it has become an exhibit in a museum, only to be admired from the outside. It cannot be approached or touched, let alone entered. What happened to the Parthenon is what was attempted with the Greek language through purification, a combination of what the Greeks call anastylωση, re-erection and supplementation, and anapaleosi, the stripping of later additions to reveal the pristine form of a building. It is indicative that the Greeks have felt the need to invent the term anapaleosi, making something old again, which is the opposite of renovation, making something new again, and which might be rendered into Latinate English as reverteration. And the revival of the purification could be seen with the new Acropolis Museum, as you could see in the figures I showed you earlier. The museum was built and wanted to have a direct visual contact with the Acropolis, and nothing in between should intervene. And in this way, anything post-classical should be removed to go back, jump back to the past. This is also, you could see in the Bavarian visions of the Acropolis, that they had this kind of visions of building even a new palace on the Acropolis, and you could see some of these plans here on the slides, and also on this one. They were trying to rebuild the Acropolis with their own buildings and their own visions. The visit to the Acropolis in 1865 by a 20-year-old French engineering student whose subsequent academic paper led to 2 learned academies later that year, and recapitulated with illustrations in his highly influential 2-volume History of Architecture in 1899, would have far-reaching ramifications for the avant-garde architecture of the 20th century. This also could be seen in the whole point was just to show that there are no straight lines in the Parthenon, but everything is curved, but this curve is not visible through the naked eye. Later on, you could see that the connection of the Parthenon with modern architecture in Le Corbusier, who coupled the Parthenon with the automobile. So you could see the classical and the modern side by side. Moving on to the use of the symbolic use of the Parthenon in the modern age, the so-called Parthenon revival. We have 3 of the most commonly cited examples of Greek revival architecture. One from Bavaria, again, and Leo von Klenz was influential in constructing this in 1830 to 1842, and 2 from the United States. One is the Second Bank of the United States in Philadelphia, and the other one is the Custom House in New York, 1833, 1842. You could see that they tried to imitate the columns of the Parthenon. It should be said that not all Greek intellectuals have approved of this anapaleosi, the reveteration of ancient monuments. In the run-up to the Athens Olympic Games of 1896, for which the ancient stadium was being reconstructed, the poet Kostis Palamas castigated those who set about restoring ancient monuments, accusing them of barbarism. Oh, I forgot to mention also the other American Parthenons in Nashville, Tennessee, and the National Archive building in Washington. Now, going back to the Athens Olympics and the poet Kostis Palamas, Palamas castigated those who set about restoring ancient monuments, accusing them of barbarism. Or should, he said, keep the monuments in the state in which time was rendered them to us, including the buildings that have been added since antiquity. He concluded that it was better to let the imagination do the restoration work instead. Palamas's perceptions of the Parthenon betray two different directions in his poetry, that of the national poet and that of the supporter of the spoken language. In his first role, the poet emphasizes the symbolic value of the monument, restores the ancient temple, and sings the unfading beauty of the Greek spirit, which is reborn in the Athens of his time. I should point out that Palamas also composed the Olympic hymn for the 1896 Olympic Games in Athens. But for the poet who fights for the cause of the modern Greek language, the Demotic, this kind of symbolic value is criticized. We can see Palamas's attitude as a national poet in his largest work with such aspirations, The King's Flute in 1910. In the third canto, the temple is described as transcending time. It seems to be the result of divine agency, a miracle humans are unable to repeat. What is more, the temple is organically related to the Attic landscape, and only there does it take on its full meaning. Its height is spiritual rather than physical compared to the pyramids, and it is the result of political freedom and democracy, an echo of the writings of Wilkelman on ancient Greek sculpture. In Canto 7, finally, Palamas gives us an ekphrasis of the Parthenon, describing in some detail all those beauties that justify the temple's idealization in Spain. Such an idealizing attitude towards the Parthenon persists to some extent even in those cases in which Palamas acknowledges its ruined condition. Of course, one cannot expect the poet to be consistent throughout his voluminous work, but if we speak here of a dominant trends, then one of those is the fact that for Palamas, the ruins of the Parthenon and other monuments give intimations of the ideal world traditionally identified with ancient Greek sculpture. Inscribed in Western cultural history and imagination, from Syriac of Ancona to Keats, through Le Corbusier and Freud to Nashville, Tennessee, the Acropolis emerges as an imperial and colonial construct with no place for living Greeks, a space in which to register the difference between the Hellenes of the eternity and the Greeks of history. With a few exceptions mentioned earlier, the Acropolis does not feature prominently in the Greek literature of the last 2 centuries. Its demythologization can be seen in poems such as Acropolis, 1933 by Nicholas Callas. And in this poem, Callas sees the Parthenon not only as part of the national imaginary, which needs to be demythologized, he also treats it as a symbol of the upper classes, which has to be undermined. And judging from his ironic use of the word Parthenos and not Parthenon as part of Psycharis' linguistic orthodoxy. Callas mentions the Swiss photographer Fred Boissonnas and the dancer Delila. You could see here on the slide, in an allusion to the dancers Paiva and Nikolska, who had been photographed semi-naked by Nelly, a Greek photographer, in 1927 and 1929 on the Acropolis, which allows him to criticize in a roundabout fashion the touristic exploitation of the Parthenon. Also, there is a reference to Karl Baedeker in the poem and its use as a theatrical backdrop. In his poem, Callas subverts the romantic classicism associated with the Acropolis by introducing modern imagery to undermine the emblematic role of the Parthenon and calling into question the ideal of classical harmony through the poem's syntactical anarchy and its lack of punctuation. The ironic juxtaposition of an idealized past with the modernity of the present, also evident in the poem Tram and Acropolis by the surrealist poet Nikos Angonopoulos. Tram and Acropolis was published in 1938, underlines the breakdown of the relationship between art and tradition and confirms Callas's belief that art is a powder cake and the proof is the Parthenon. Contemporary Greek writers have also been conducting a critique calling for Parthenon to be destroyed and trying to undermine classicism without living Greeks. Recent films about the Acropolis have also been considered irreverent and subversive and have stirred up controversy. Adopting a documentary format and a feminist perspective, Eva Stefani's short film Acropolis 2001 contrasts the ideality of the national monument with the materiality of the body and associates the commercialization of cultural heritage with a pornographic treatment of the female body. Costa Gavras' short video on the history of the Parthenon, part of a larger film produced for the 2004 Athens Olympics and meant to be shown to visitors on the occasion of the opening of the new Acropolis Museum in June 2009, offended the church by presenting figures in black robes defacing the Parthenon metopes, a reference to the alleged hostility of Christians towards pagan temples after the 4th century CE. The ongoing process by which the material remains of the Greeks' ancient heritage is being discovered under the ground, from the Acropolis excavations in the 19th century to the tunneling of the Athens metro in the 1990s and early 2000s, has brought modern Greeks into direct contact with ancient culture and has been one of the major factors that have enabled them to see it as their own. No visitor to Syntagma Square in Athens, for instance, can fail to be impressed by the extraordinary way in which the various layers of human habitation and activity dating back for at least 300 years have been preserved in one of the walls of the huge pit that was dug for the construction of the metro station there, and in which is now on public display in situ. Perhaps only in Greece and within the narrow confines of the city of Rome can you have such a vivid sense of having the remains of thousands of years of human civilization around you and under your feet. Nowadays, Greek popular perceptions of the past seem mixed. On the one hand, the ordinary Greeks are proud of their ancient heritage, glad to see antiquities displayed on the Athens metro or the inside pages of their passports, and eager to build to sell replicas of the Parthenon for touristic purposes, or wear replicas of Greek warriors' helmets at football matches. But few know this heritage in depth or have ever visited the Acropolis. And you could see a replica of the Parthenon in a hotel in Chalkidiki in Greece. You could see how the Parthenon has been used for different ways, and also as part of a demonstration with a banner reading "The peoples have the power and never surrender." Even if ordinary people choose to lead their lives without thinking about the sacred rock, they are constantly reminded of its existence by the fact that most of the interviews conducted by the foreign media in Athens, and often replayed in Greece, use the Acropolis as a standard iconic backdrop. Construction work often brings archaeologists into conflict with individuals, pressure groups of business. The discovery in 2011 of the altar of the 12 gods during the renovation of a railway line in central Athens is a case in point. The railway authorities pushed for the altar to be buried under the tracks again, but archaeologists and lovers of antiquities resisted such a move. The story was complicated even further by the fact that most of the protest against the plans to re-enter the altar involved the self-professed dodecaists, worshippers of the Olympian gods, to whom the altar was originally dedicated back in antiquity and located near the Agora. The attempt to develop mass tourism and to entice visitors to Greece canonized the neoclassical aesthetic and shaped post-war presentations of the country through the marketing ploys of the Greek National Tourism Organization. Greek antiquity has been popularized through tourist advertising. Greeks is for lovers, inscribed on small metal ionic columns, and country branding, leave your meat in Greece. Building houses with ancient columns, you could see on the right, typifies another superficial engagement with antiquity, while open-air performances of ancient drama in summer festivals and translations of ancient texts have both popularized antiquity in a more serious way. Though have also highlighted antiquity as a contested area. And you could see also the commercial use of the Parthenon, which goes back a number of years with the columns of the Parthenon as Coca-Cola bottles. The Western press and political cartoonists often draw on antiquity in order to portray the country's economic crisis and satirize its modern inadequacies. And the Parthenon plays an important and iconic role. This is an area where popular or stereotypical perceptions of antiquity could be further explored and interrogated by looking at how modern perceptions and ancient images interact in the press and social media. More specifically, the Greek economic crisis has offered to cartoonists and journalists the opportunity to tap into ancient symbols and images, making corrections with current developments, concerns, and prejudices. The Acropolis became the centerpiece of this imagery, with the Parthenon presented as crumbling, propped up, or for sale. In one cartoon, European taxpayers have replaced the columns and are piled up on top of the other to support the pediment where the Greeks are seen disporting themselves. Other sources of inspiration for cartoonists or graphic designers included Discobolus, Heracles, or Aphrodite, especially the Venus de Milo, as symbolic images of economic mismanagement or the ailing Greek economy. The cover of the German magazine Focus in February 2010 outraged the Greeks by presenting the Venus de Milo making a rude gesture next to the headline, cheats in the Euro family. While the cover of The Economist, May 2010, with a heading Acropolis Now, showed the Parthenon with the German Chancellor Merkel in combat uniform and helicopters flying overhead, and the cover of Der Spiegel announced Acropolis adieu. In an attempt to illustrate why Greece should leave the Eurozone using appropriate classical imagery. But then the use of the Parthenon as a kind of prison camp goes back to the Balkan crisis, and then you could see on the right another drawing which goes back to the early 1990s and then the Balkan crisis. As a visual metaphor, Greek antiquity serves the symbolic colonialism through which Western media expressed their frustration at Greece's modern inhabitants, who have supposedly diminished or humiliated ancient gods and heroes. The modern Greeks have wasted their symbolic capital and dishonored their heritage. Thus, they do not deserve their classical past, which can therefore be appropriated by the West on moral and economic grounds. This elitist exploitation of antiquity by the Western media is designed to arouse the public's anxieties and construct a stereotypical image that portrays modern Greeks as usurpers of a glorious past. But also you could see a different kind of use of the Acropolis And this brings us to a more recent example with the Documenta 14, Germany's prestigious contemporary art event, which was divided between Athens from April to July 2017 and Kassel from June to September 1917. An Argentinian artist invited people to donate once or currently banned books and will give them back to the public when the installation is dismantled. He used these books to build a symbolic Parthenon, as you could see on the screen, a symbol of democracy and free speech, and a reminder that literary censorship still exists today. The installation has been built on the rise of Nazi book burnings of the 1930s. So you could see different uses and different symbolic appropriations of the Parthenon. And just to conclude, I would like to bring you attention to the other heritage politics in Greece and compare two monuments with the Parthenon. In the past, the concept of monument in Greece was invoked almost exclusively with reference to the remains of antiquity. And as a result, the preservation of post-classical sites was not part of the heritage agenda or national iconography. The remains of other periods, particularly those recalling foreign domination, were condemned to oblivion or caused long-standing aversion. I'll use two examples. The third one are the Venetian monuments. The Venetian walls of Candia, the Heraklion in Crete, were described by a 19th century novelist, Spiridon Zambelius, as resembling a crown of thorns, while a number of churches in central Athens were demolished during the 19th century, due either to their dilapidated condition, road building projects, or to the proximity to ancient monuments. Moves from the 1960s onwards to renovate a few non-classical monuments for touristic purposes and to increase the number of experts in later periods on the staff of the Greek Archaeological Service were not sufficient to challenge the dominance of the ancient monuments in the national imagination. Economic development and urban modernization also led to the demolition of a few later monuments, as happened on Crete with a large Gothic-style 14th century church of San Salvador. You could see a faint photograph on the slide. This church in central Heraklion was converted to a mosque in the Ottoman period, then into a school in the 20th century, and was finally demolished in 1972 during the period of the military junta on the basis that it was not a monument of Greek culture. Following the slow process of recognition of the importance, first of the Byzantine, then the Venetian, and much later the Ottoman heritage, the monuments of those periods increasingly came to the fore and started competing for attention with those of classical antiquity. In late 20th century, the Roman, Venetian, and Ottoman past of Greece acquired greater significance, even though the controversy in the mid-1990s surrounding the Rotonda, a building from the Roman period situated in the heart of Thessaloniki, points in the opposite direction. You could see it on the screen. Despite suggestion that it was intended as a mausoleum for the Emperor Galerius, the original use of the Rotonda is not known. At some point between the 4th and the 6th centuries, it was converted to the Christian church, even serving for two periods as the Cathedral of Thessaloniki. And in 1591, more than 150 years after the conquest of the city by the Ottomans, it was turned into a mosque. Following the capture of Thessaloniki by the Greeks in 1912, the Rotonda once again became a church, but only for a brief period before it was declared a national monument in 1913. Excavation started there a few years later. As a Roman building and potentially a reminder of the subjugation of Greece to foreign powers, the Rotonda was not considered part of the Greek heritage by the church, and therefore they wanted to Hellenize and Christianize, particularly after its restoration in the 1990s. By turning it back once again into a church instead of allowing it to be used as a civic space for exhibitions and meetings and perhaps as a museum. Apart from being emblematic of the conflict between state secularism and clerical fanaticism, the rotunda is an example of the way Roman monuments are treated in Greece and how they can be Hellenized through a process of religious use. The Venetian monuments in Crete and the rotunda in Thessaloniki point to the politics of heritage and the role of archaeology in the Greek national imagination. The repatriation of antiquities has often symbolized the reconstruction of Greece and its culture from antique components dispersed in space and time, local and global, and have raised the question of who owns antiquity. The reception of antiquity in Greece is not just an area of study, but is implicated in public debates, identity controversies, cultural politics, and education policy. What I have tried to show in this short lecture is that the Parthenon and other monuments have a story to tell us, which goes beyond classical antiquity. And this classical story should not be marginalized because it adds to their attraction and help us to make the transition from the eternal glory to critical history. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri, for this exploration of the Parthenon as a national symbol, and for this reminder that Greece, perhaps contrary to many other nation states in the Balkans, wishes to maintain a self-image, a world image that is fashioned according to the taste of the West rather than anything else. And although, of course, in any nation state in the Balkans or elsewhere, archaeology is a pillar of nationalism. Greek archaeology is rather peculiar in that it reinforces a Western imagery of distinction and privilege, of course. Are there any questions, remarks, commentaries? Giannakis Papadopoulos.
Hello. In modern times, can be judged to removing other buildings from Parthenon as crime to the history, to Byzantic Orthodox times, or not?
What do you mean? I mean, just by modern times?
As present times, can we judging as something bad to removing buildings from Byzantium, from Parthenon? I had discussed on my university about this. It is a crime to removing other parts of the history to show pure of the Parthenon.
The cleansing of the Parthenon from any post-classical buildings or constructions was completed in the 19th century. But there was a strong opposition to the removal of the two listed buildings in front of the Acropolis Museum. There was a huge campaign to keep them. And eventually this campaign was very successful in keeping those listed buildings in front of the Acropolis Museum. So the recognition of the post-classical architecture succeeded. And those who argued for the removal of the buildings were defeated.
I think that even for the Frankish Tower, there was some some protest for its removal back in the 19th century. But I think is that correct? I'm not sure. But
Yes, yes. Yes.
So I suppose Professor Tziovas, I was at another meeting, at another discussion about the Acropolis the other day, and one of the questions was that if the Acropolis today, if it were the way it was when the Turks left, you know, with the Turkish village inside and the cemetery and the everything. Would it be cleansed now? I suppose it would not, but I don't know what's your opinion on that.
I mean, they might have removed them and put them in a museum. I mean, now what we know about those is either through paintings by travelers or from books. I mean, that's the whole point, is that there is no museum, there is no even a section of the museum which is dedicated to the post-classical story of the Parthenon, which in my view, it's very interesting, because I think the Parthenon is unique in this respect. It has become a monument, a church, a mosque, a ruin. I think in that respect is unique. But this story of the Parthenon is not, apart from the books and an elite of academics, is not recorded anywhere. And the visitor to the Parthenon does not become aware of this post-classical and very interesting story.
Anastasia?
Yes, it's more of a question. Professor Tziovas, thank you very much for this lecture. The neighborhood of Anafiotika, how did they got away of demolition? Because I know that there was a problem came up at some time that these houses should be demolished in order to continue the excavations in the slopes of the Acropolis, around the slopes of the Acropolis. Do you know what happened then, and if this problem was in the wider situation during the Bavarian period of revealing the classical past of the Greeks?
I'm not sure how they escaped, but because perhaps they were considered as temporal structures for those who were working there, and perhaps the whole idea is that they should have been rehoused. But also the emphasis was on another cleansing, because they cleared houses in the Athenian Agora. So there was another cleansing going on there, which is also important. So
in the Vrissaki neighborhood. I think it was Vrissaki, the name. Vrissaki. Yes.
And I think that the focus was on there because they wanted to do excavations. Because Anafiotika is on the slope, they were not expecting to find any remains there. But then I suspect that they were considered as temporary structures. And that's why they thought that they can be rehoused as soon as then new accommodation was available.
Thank you.
Larry?
Hello. I think what is really interesting is that to this day, nobody knows about these multiple phases of Acropolis. It is not taught at schools. And I mean, I was in primary school before some years, but I was raised by a Byzantine archaeologist. And if I didn't end up to the Department of Archaeology, probably I wouldn't know about them. And why do you think that up to this day, nobody talks about these things?
Yeah, because the emphasis was on the classical side. I mean, it's not only the Parthenon, also the Sicyon has undergone similar cleansing and reconstruction and so on, because the emphasis was put on the classical past. Only a few years ago, they started to emphasize, not to highlight the Byzantine and the Ottoman. I mean, if you compare the guides, the city guides to Athens and particularly Salonika, for example, there was no mention 20 years ago. There was no mention of the Ottoman baths or the mosques. Only recently, just they started renovating and acknowledging the multiplicity of the past. So it just this kind of fixation on the classical, I think it's counterproductive. I think the post-classical story of some of these monuments is very interesting, and perhaps more interesting than just the classical past. And I think that kind of museum should highlight not only the Parthenon, but the entire area, the transformations. I mean, the Roman contribution, the Ottoman contribution with the two mosques close to the Acropolis, and then all the transformation of the wider area, which is unknown. I mean, somebody should be aware of this. And this gets started also with the fact that the books on the Acropolis, like the Parthenon by Mary Beard, which is more a popular book, and also the book by Jennifer Niles, they have got, they cover briefly that kind of post-classical period of the Parthenon.
Thank you. Now, Bettina.
Yes, thank you very much for an intriguing presentation. I think it's a helpful reminder that selective erasure of certain sort of aspects of the past or certain periods of the past can also be obviously political in important ways. And it strikes me too that there's a parallel here a little bit with the way that there's a tension between traditionalists, let's say in something like folk dancing or folk music or even language, and the idea that those can be frozen in time or fossilized and should be kept in that sort of permanent state of choosing a particular moment and not allowing these living traditions to continue to evolve. And I think that's a similar kind of tension. My question is, at what point, I mean, how far do you allow that to go? And is there an extent to which allowing the accretional sort of history, the sort of constant layering of new, in this case, sort of contemporary elements onto an older substrate, and how far would you allow that to go? Because at some point you wouldn't be able to unpeel everything again in order to sort of interpret it in a particular fashion. There'd be so many layers. I mean, I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's just there's a historic preservation problem there too on some level.
Thank you for your question. It's very difficult to say because this is the job of a preservationist or an archaeologist, not an archaeologist. But what I would say is that this kind of cultural policy towards the monuments or the heritage politics is part of the wider cultural policy, because this kind of cleansing, which went on the Acropolis, was also a linguistic policy, a wider cultural policy with emphasis on the classical and less emphasis on other periods. But how you preserve and show this is a difficult question. Obviously now it's too late for the Parthenon. Perhaps in a museum, I don't know technically how you can transfer some parts or reconstruct some of this in a museum, but also the fact that it just very little is known about these constructions, because what we know about them is either through texts or the drawings of the travelers. And I don't know whether there is sufficient information for any form of reconstruction. But this is a more general problem, I suppose.
Well, if I may intervene regarding what you just asked, so how you don't know how you do it in a museum. Well, I think it's simpler than it sounds. First of all, you don't tell lies. In the Acropolis Museum, as we speak, there is a model of the Acropolis in 1500, okay, 1500 AD, okay? And it's mentioned there that the Parthenon is a church. Well, this is a lie. The Parthenon in 1500 AD was already a mosque for 25 years. It had been turned into a mosque since the 70s of that century. If you don't want to say that the Parthenon had been turned into a mosque, you simply make a model for not 1500, but 1490 or 1400 something else. You don't need to tell a lie. And the other thing is, every bit of the Parthenon is either on the Parthenon itself or the museum right now, with the exception of a single block, which was turned into the pulpit of the church, and it's in the Christian Museum in Athens. I mean, why do you do this? You can easily write a document, ask the Christian Museum to loan this bit of the Parthenon, put it in the Acropolis Museum, so that you show everything. But if you want to obliterate, as you say, the post-classical history of the Parthenon, of the Acropolis, this is how you do it. You just tell lies or you omit pieces of evidence. It's very simple. It's very easy to do. Natalia has a question or a comment, and then Burak, and then we start another round.
Actually, you semi-answered my question, but it's okay. I had a comment as well. Thank you, Professor, for this lecture. Actually, I really like how you showed us the levels of appropriateness and negotiations of acceptable layers of history, and also the preservation role in the presentation of those layers. So my question was related to the presentation part and what is articulated in museum and the current presentation. Are any of these data that you showed us, those are integrated in, I don't know, Acropolis? Because it was a long time ago since I was visiting Athens, before this new Acropolis Museum, and currently I don't know what has been put in the official presentation, and are these data presented? So that's it.
Yeah, as I said, the emphasis is on classical, and as Dimitris pointed out, is very little. But also, it's interesting that not only the museums, if you try to teach a kind of a module on the Parthenon, in Greek is very little material in the post-classical. The most material is in English or other languages, and also by Greeks writing in English. In Greek is very little on the kind of this post-classical. And then this is telling also of the attitudes. Just to deal with the post-classical Parthenon is not so important as to deal with the classical Parthenon. So what you see in the museums is reflected also in the scholarship in Greek.
And Burak?
Thank you. This is a hypothetical one. I hope it's not touched upon already, because Zoom is kicking me out constantly. Well, in eyes of today's Athenians, what do you think they would vote for if they had the chance? Would they like to keep the eternity and unchanging nature of Acropolis as today, linking them to the classical? Or would they vote for the keeping of the post-classical attachments to it? Thank you.
Thank you. Just if I understood you well, because there is an echo in your sounding. It's just I think that there is a gradual recognition that the post-classical heritage is also important. They try at least to preserve, and this could be seen in the Ottoman heritage. Next to the Acropolis, there is a mosque, and this has been renovated. I mean, in the past, all the Ottoman mosques were not renovated, and I think now there is an awareness that this kind of different pasts, Byzantine, Venetian, Ottoman, Roman, and so on. They need to be acknowledged. And also the heritage has to be promoted somehow, not as much as the classical.
But what is the attitude of the Athenians themselves, you think?
But themselves. Sorry,
Yes,
he asks if we were to have a referendum today, keep it or let it go. Would we keep the Ottoman village and the Frankish tower, or would we vote for for them to get demolished today? But Burak, I mean, you mean if we had them, right?
Yeah, I mean, for ordinary people would say to remove them, and this also, I think, it should be accompanied by another poll asking them whether they have visited the Acropolis, because the evidence shows that few Athenians have actually visited the Acropolis and the Parthenon itself. So this is also has to do with the public attitudes and the knowledge of the monuments by the public.
Anastasia, you want to come back, and then Cosmin?
Yeah, I just would like to add something. To be honest, I think that they would have voted to preserve everything, just as Professor Tziovas believes. But the archaeologists, the ministry, and in general the intellectuals, I'm not sure about the people. And to be honest, I think that the Greek people is completely ignorant of 5 centuries of of being part of the Ottoman Empire. It's completely ignorant. So I think they would be surprised if they saw all these little Ottoman houses on the rock of the Acropolis. It would be a shock.
They wouldn't be surprised. They would be furious. Okay,
yes.
They would kill us all.
Yes.
Okay, let's be frank
polite.
about it.
I was being polite. Yeah.
I actually have been since Dimitris mentioned teaching. I have been censured inside the Acropolis Museum. I was with a group of my students, and it's all very nice because sometimes I teach classical archaeology, sculpture, and so I say things like, this figure, that statue, that date. But that one, it was a heritage management class, and we had this. It's like a seminar, but it was a seminar on site. And I was talking about these things, what Professor Tziovas has just elaborated on, and I was stopped by one of the guards. Said I shouldn't be talking like that. Okay, that I was lying to my students. Okay, Cosmin.
Thank you very much, Professor Dimitris, for exposing this very fascinating case indeed. I think the case of Greece and how it sees its past and its identity is in many respects unique. And I'm wondering if today's way of promoting Greece outside, so of making tourism inside Greece, isn't connected to this continuing perpetuation of the classical heritage and of stressing only the classical Athens versus the later histories. Because I'm imagining this is largely the image of Athens, the popular image of Athens outside the country. Tourists are expecting to see classical heritage when they visit Greece. And in this sense, we are kind of returning back to 200 years ago when Greece was building its state according to a Western image. Now Greece is also promoting its image according to these international requirements of tourism, of global tourism.
Yeah, tourism plays an important role. And I'll give you 2 examples. One is just the acknowledgement of the Ottoman past. You could see that Kemal Atatürk, the founder of modern Turkey, was born in Salonika. And you could see that now his house has been renovated in order to attract Turkish tourists. So the marketing plays an important role and ignores narrow-minded nationalism. On the other hand, you could see also a kind of Hellenization. Take, for example, the Minoan Crete. Minoan Crete was not strictly speaking Greek, but it has become part of the Hellenic continuum, and it's presented as such as part of the Greek heritage in order to, again, to promote tourism, but also to promote the national pride. So you could see different uses of the past for different reasons.
Now it's Paulina's turn, I think.
Yes, thank you for this inspiring lecture, making me think of the fact that sometimes I wish I didn't know all this to enjoy the monuments as I see them and think that I'm really, you know, in connection with the past, because it's similar for, I don't know, every French cathedral. It's not the real Gothic thing in reality. I just want to give you one striking example, which is, of course, in Poland, due to the Second World War, we had most of our built heritage in ruins. So there were different decisions being made about different places, how and whether to rebuild them, reconstruct them, and in what manner. And the most spectacular case, of course, was Warsaw, which was basically erased from the surface of the ground. And when the decision was made actually to rebuild it, it was also only by then the communist government only partially allowed. So, for example, the city, the buildings where regular people lived, were allowed to be rebuilt, but the royal castle was in ruin until late 1970s. It was so again, it was like a city without its main part of the old town, because they didn't want to have the symbol of sovereign country reconstructed. Some churches were also not reconstructed, or reconstructed in a smaller scale. And you could say funny thing about it is that also it turned out that there wasn't enough documentation to prove what, you know, things that were destroyed and almost immediately decided to be rebuilt just within the next few years. Everyone, of course, knew more or less, and there were a lot of photos how the city looked, but there was no precise documentation. So a decision was made to, instead of reconstructing the city as it was just before the Second World War, there was a decision made to use paintings of Warsaw from late 18th century, which were absolutely precise by an Italian painter, Canaletto. He had a whole series done on what the city of Warsaw then looked like. And this is how it was rebuilt, according to those paintings. So, for example, my own grandmother, she never wanted to visit the old town when I was a child, saying that for her, it's like a theater. It doesn't look like the old town that she remembered as being a little girl. And today, speaking of tourists and their ignorance, in several places of the old town, there are copies of these paintings by Canaletto from the 18th century set up. So tourists can compare how this city looks now and how it looked in the 18th century. And everyone is so happy that it practically didn't change, except from the McDonald's sign and Starbucks. It's exactly the same thing. And I guess that probably, I don't know, 95% has no idea that this was made deliberately 80 years ago and has nothing to do with the real thing. But it's even inscribed on the UNESCO list, but as a reconstruction, as an example of reconstruction, not as a real thing. So just a side comment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. And here you touch upon an important aspect, is the international expectations, because with the Parthenon, there are international expectations because the Parthenon has been used as a model for buildings in the UK, in all over Europe, in America. So there is a kind of international image of the Parthenon itself. Therefore, those, for example, we have seen the St. Pancras in London, close to Euston Station. They go back to Erechtheion in Athens, and they expect to see differences, similarities, and so on. So the replicas of the Parthenon, or partly replicas of the Parthenon or the Erechtheion or the other buildings, play an important role in the imagination, because they try to see differences and similarities. So the international expectations in reconstructions and national heritage plays an important role, I think.
Okay, and Diana?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Tziovas, for this indeed fascinating talk. We know, of course, that the appropriation of, that for quite some time, of course, the classical period held this prime place and almost hegemonic place, so to say, on the, as a cultural identity of modern Greece. However, by the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, the Byzantine period was already well appropriated as the medieval period of Greek history, right? So by the beginning of the 20th century, with some delay, we already have Byzantium fully rehabilitated as part and parcel, as an imminent part of Greek continuity and Greek history. As an archaeological asset, it was a gradual process, of course, and I don't think it was before the beginning, even the second decade of the 20th century, that the first laws postulating the conservation of Byzantine monuments were actually enacted. That is quite late, almost a century later than the respective, the Ottonian regime and the all this conservation work at that time, a century earlier. But once this began, this was irreversible process. As a matter of fact, it could also be seen as a kind of sui generis rebellion or subversion of the Western view of Greece by incorporating by incorporating cultures such as the Byzantine, which is not part of the European cultural self-narration, which is not part of the European canon. And in this way, the incorporation of the Byzantine into the Greek historical canon can be seen also as a subversion of the Western view. But my question is, didn't it somehow play into the later, from the beginning of the 20th century onwards, into the later presentations of the Acropolis, as by incorporating also the Byzantine post-classical period somehow in it? Thank you.
Sorry, what's the question?
My question is this reconfiguration of the historical self-narration of the Greeks, of the historical canon, by incorporating the Byzantine, didn't it affect the way the Byzantine post-classical period was presented in the Acropolis in later periods? As I said, that is from the early 20th century onwards.
You're right about the rehabilitation of Byzantium in the 20th century, but there is also a reversal. For example, Salonika, the emphasis on Greek archaeology in Salonika was on the Byzantine Salonika. But since 1977, with excavation in Vergina, the emphasis was placed on the classical or even later classical period, because for political reasons, because it was the Macedonian question and so on. So all the funding, because it also has to do the funding, although it was directed in Salonika in northern Greece towards Byzantine excavations and preservations, then the funding went to prove the Greekness of Macedonia. So again, although as you said, the rehabilitation of Byzantium occurred during the 20th century, in the last quarter of the 20th century, in the early 21st century, the emphasis was again on classical or later classical period in order to prove the Greekness of Macedonia, and all the funding, because it also has to do with the funding, went there. But it depends also on how the Byzantium was treated. Was treated something as part of the East, or something more, again, in dialogue with the West. And you could see that there is this important book and controversial book by Anthony Calvellis on the Christian Parthenon, which is basically the Byzantine Parthenon. When Nikitas Choniatis, for example, visited the Acropolis and recited a poem and so on. So it is indeed a kind of a complex story, which has to do with not only with the politics of heritage, but also the politics of funding and other priorities, particularly about the focus of heritage and archaeology in northern Greece, with particularly from with the revival of the Macedonian question.
If I may add to this, because it also adds to the discussion we had previously with Susanne's lecture about the status of state archaeologists within a country. No matter what, and no matter how much 20th century intellectuals have worked for the rehabilitation of Byzantium following the late 19th century efforts on behalf of the historians, the hierarchy in Greece remains the same. First come the classical archaeologists like myself, okay? I should emphasize this. Then come everything else. We allow prehistorians to be with us because they're quasi-classical, because they deal with Homer and stuff like that. And we, as Dimitris has said, we have even Hellenized Minoan Crete and of course, prehistoric Cyclades. So everything is classical. And then comes Byzantium, which is accepted, of course, is rehabilitated, but all major decisions are usually done on the level of classical antiquity. And the Parthenon, and I think Dimitris has shown this, the Parthenon remains unbeatable. You cannot argue against the Parthenon in contemporary Greece. There's no way you can do it. A recent scandal of archaeological preservation in Greece is happening as we speak in Thessaloniki. During the excavations, the construction of the metro there was an archaeological excavation which revealed a very important early Byzantine site, the actual crossroads of the late Roman, early Byzantine city, which is a unique find, uniquely preserved. And for 5 or 6 years now, we've been going to and fro to the High Court and municipal bodies and then central government and back again to decide whether we're going to demolish it, build the metro, or build the station, because the metro runs underneath it all, but build the station. And I don't think that anyone in Greece doubts that if this were a classical corner of yet another classical building, if this were in Athens, the metro would have stopped, and we would have made another. I mean, and Dimitris showed some of the stations. We would have created another metro station with antiquities like a museum, and that would be it. But the fact that we're discussing still whether to preserve it or not means, I think, that we are prejudiced, still prejudiced against anything that is not classical or accepted as such. Because as I said, pre-classical and some post-classical is disguised into classical through a rhetoric going back for decades. But
could the explanation also lie in the fact that somehow the claimants, those who claim lineage from classical Greece, are much less than those who claim lineage from the Byzantine Empire? I mean, apart from the fact that classical heritage remains much more prestigious somehow, we know why, etc., etc. I mean, Byzantine heritage is much more ambivalent in this sense. But is it also because somehow this lineage, I mean, somehow classical Greece is much more usable as a proto image of modern Greece, precisely because of its smaller, non-ecumenical, non-cosmopolitan in the Christian sense of the word, of shape and so on. So it's more usable for nation building purposes to this day, apart from its more prestigious content, etc., etc. Rather than the Byzantium, which is a multi-cultural, multi-ethnic, etc. empire.
I don't think we treat Byzantium as multicultural, not at all. I mean, most Greeks would be surprised to hear this, to hear you say this, because of course you're Bulgarian and a historian, and what do you know about Byzantium? But I'm sure Dimitris would like to answer that.
Here is that Byzantium and Christianity are interrelated, and one way to see where there is an inclination towards the classical past of Byzantium are the names, whether the names of children are Christian or classical. But then regarding the Byzantium, just one important aspect is to see how also the Western interests could influence developments inside Greece. For example, in the last 20 or 30 years, there are major Byzantine exhibitions in London. And I think this kind of interest in Byzantium in the Western world influences similar trends in Greece itself. The fact that Byzantium is presented as a multinational, global and transcultural empire plays an important role. And sometimes Greeks try to follow that, sometimes to resist it and present Byzantium as Greek. So 30 years ago, I was teasing my Byzantinist colleagues who students confused Byzantine studies with business studies. But you could see now Byzantium in the West and Byzantine studies have flourished. And we have to see the wider international context, which has an impact also on countries which were part of the Byzantine Empire. I mean, from Georgia to Greece to Bulgaria and Serbia and so on. So we should not ignore the transnational reception of Byzantium and its impact into its reception in the countries, in the Balkan countries. Excuse my hoarse voice.
No, it's okay.
Okay, then Oana and then Anastasia.
Okay, thank you. So I will be very, very honest. From the point of view of the Romanian tourist, if they will go in Greece and you ask, and I'm telling you this because I work with the tourists, they will tell you they want beaches and they want to see the classic Greek history and not Moscow. And we ask a lot of time why, because there are two things that they want to experience in Greece after the beaches. Of course, it will be this part of classic history and the part of Christianity history. What means Meteora and other stuff. Of course, why? If they want to have the experience of a Moscow, they will choose immediately Turkey, to visit Turkey. So for example, if they prepare a group for going in Turkey, they will say, we must visit the Blue Mosque. So why? Because they want to feel the vibe. You can feel the vibe and everything in a mosque, they said, in Greece. They can imagine, they can feeling. Now, from the point of the view of the science, if there will be a referendum in Greece, which maintain Parthenon in Acropolis, the classic one or not, I can assure you the Romanian one will vote the classic one. It's very important. I know that especially in Cluj-Napoca University, the part of the ancient history of Greek, it's very, very important. The classic one, I think it's the god of everything. And even in Bucharest also, they study a lot of this period. And one thing that is very interesting, even then we look back in the communist period, it was very allowed to speak about what means Greek democracy in the ancient time. So this is very, very interesting. This was allowed to speak in a good way about democracy. So for all the people, for all the teachers that were formed in the communist period, it was like a place to speak free about democracy. That wasn't, of course, the same situation speaking about democracy in France on in England, because in that moment you had to put a flag and say they are not good, they are bad boys. But speaking about, I don't know, Pericle times or everything else, it was more open. So this, I think it would be very important, and it's quite different how you see all the things.
Well, when Professor Tziovas and I talk about mosques, we don't necessarily mean mosques for the tourists to come and see. We also mean because they're Greeks who are not Christians, the Greeks who are Muslims, and archaeology, and we discussed this yesterday in the conference last weekend, that inclusion needs to be part of our policies, and by eliminating everything that is not Christian or not classical in Greece, you exclude parts of your heritage, but that's not that much of a problem. The problem is that you exclude parts of the actual living population of the country from a heritage that is theirs, and you deny them the privilege or the right to look up to an old mosque and say, okay, well, there were people of my faith here 200, 300, 400 years ago, centuries ago. I
agree, because you can even give the opportunity to choose what to visit or to see, or not only to visit, what to know, the information, the access on the information. You don't put it on the table.
That's why I talked about inclusion. I mean, I don't think anyone wants to restore a mosque for tourist purposes. Perhaps they do because yeah, it looks nice, whatever. But you kind of need to include the rest of your population.
Of course, but the part with the tourist was a little bit and for amusement, and not the scientific, and not for the purpose of what we are talking here.
I don't know, Dimitris would like to comment, and then we have questions from Anastasia, Natalia, and Paulina, and Clary, and everybody.
Very briefly, there is no way that the post-classical aspect of Greek history could upstage the classical one, but at least it should be acknowledged and highlighted. I remember a few years ago, a student of mine went to Salonika and had one of these cheap ones, guides to the city, and there was a kind of black spot, and then was asking, what is this black spot? And it was the Turkish baths. I mean, it was acknowledged with a black spot, but no more information about it. And also the point about the Christian monuments, I mean, it's important, and that's why Christianity and Byzantium work together. And I think quite a lot of people see the Byzantine heritage from the Christian perspective.
Anastasia, you have a raised hand again? Yeah.
Yes, I would like to make a brief comment, which is on an aspect which is, I think, a paradox in Greek in modern Greek culture. For example, Professor Planzas mentioned before that the classics is above all. That's true, but I think that even above the classics is the Christian Orthodox Church, and that was proved by Professor Tziovas and the paradigm of the video that that the director Gavras had produced for the Olympic Games, where it showed that the first priests, Orthodox priests, ruined parts of the Parthenon because it was a monument from the period of paganism. And there is something strange. For example, during the Ottoman period, the Greeks were defining themselves as Romani. What are you? I'm Romanios, which means a Roman. And we still accept this characterization, but if you ask a Greek what a Roman means, he would answer, I think he would answer Greek. No, it means Roman, that you belong to the Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, which is also very confusing for modern Greeks because they think that the Byzantine Empire, it's something like a Greek empire, but it's the eastern part of the Roman Empire. So everything is a little bit misunderstood because we are not taught history, just like Larry mentioned in the beginning. That's all.
Can I ask, Diana, do you want to make another comment? Because your hand is raised.
Sorry, I must have forgotten to put it down.
Okay, so now it's Natalia's turn.
I just wanted to make a quick comment about Oana's commentation about tourists. I remember that Pierre Bourdieu was talking about reproduction as practices of teaching society to repeat, unconsciously repeat and experiences and to embody them into their knowledge. So I think that our obligations as professionals is to offer alternative, knowledgeable inclusions. And as you already mentioned, we need to talk about all other aspects of heritage. So if we continue to please and follow what tourists mean and expect to see in this country, then scientific knowledges disappear, I think.
Also, I think that I don't think we need more tourists in Greece. I mean, just before the pandemic, we had a record beating the record from the year before, beating the record from the year before. So it's okay. I mean, Dimitri.
Yeah, I mean, just but it's interesting to see how the public reacts and different kinds of tourism. I mean, in the past we thought tourism as a kind of as a single block. Now we have got religious tourism. We have got different kinds of tourism, and I think that it's an area of exploration by academics to see the different trends and also socio-cultural interests. It's an interesting area for research and how things change and how marketing and culture interact.
Paulina and then Clary.
Yeah, just a short comment that I think that in regard to Greece, speaking from a faraway country, I think we have to regard its heritage in at least two aspects, because I understand your point of view of the need to protect also more recent heritage. Like, for example, we have a discussion now on which parts of the heritage of the second half of the 20th century to protect, something that 20 years ago no one would consider of any value, and now it's a very hot topic. And this is absolutely understandable. I support it as well, and I think that this is the way it's done all over Europe, at least right now. But you're also, I'm sure, aware that this very classical image of Greece and classical image of Greek heritage has become a heritage of its own for everyone else in the world, at least in Europe. I mean, when I was, you know, choosing which specialty field to focus on when studying archaeology, I mean, it wouldn't cross my mind to do ancient Egypt or South America or something like that, because I didn't feel connected to it. I mean, I didn't feel that this is part of my own heritage, and Greek heritage or Roman heritage, or I don't know, things like that are in some way considered, I don't think not only by me, but by everyone in Europe, and probably in to a large extent worldwide, as part of their own heritage, whether you like it or not, in a good sense. And I think that this is the it's like, you know, going to Paris. I mean, the French, I'm sure the Parisians wouldn't say that Eiffel Tower is the most important part of Paris, but it's the symbol. I mean, in Warsaw, I fight the image of the Palace of Culture, which is a Stalinist building. And whenever I see it promoted as a symbol of Warsaw, I get frustrated, and I thought I think it should be demolished long time ago. But this is how we regard it. In this case, at least, this is part of your heritage. It's not something, it's much better than our situation.
Just a brief comment here. Heritage is something which involves diversification and decolonization. Now the trend in Anglophone countries and Anglophone universities is to diversify and decolonize the curriculum. Therefore, if you want to engage with new audiences, you need to highlight different aspects of your heritage. If you focus entirely on one aspect of your heritage, I think you lose diverse audiences, which might not be European, might be wider audiences.
And Clary?
I want also to make a comment regarding the inclusivity, and I want to say that the audiences are not only the tourists who choose to come. I mean, in Greece nowadays, we have a huge population of immigrants who haven't chosen to be here, and they are treated in a manner that it's not at all, I don't know how to characterize it even. So I think highlighting the other aspects of Greece, such as its Ottoman past, it's a good opportunity to show that Greece was always a multicultural space.
Yeah, I would. This is why I made my comment, Clary. Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think it's very, you can see it very, very, very easily on the field. 2 summers ago, well, the last summer I was able to take a vacation. Actually, I was on Lesbos, you know, the island with the concentration camps for refugees.
I come from there. So,
oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
So Mytilene makes an excellent example, because I was in Eresos and I spent 15 days there lying on the beach, which is great, which, you know, goes back to what tourists want from Poland. Well, tourists from Greece do want the same thing. But then I was spending a few hours in Mytilene, the town of the island, just before, you know, going back on the boat to go to Athens. And I was walking around and I noticed that there was a lot of conservation work on the island and in the town of the old Byzantine, well, they're not Byzantine, but they call them Byzantine, they're Ottoman, but okay, fortifications, the churches, this church, that church, whatever. And then you go by the mosque and you see a ruin. You go by another mosque and you see a worse ruin. And I was thinking to myself, okay, these people are refugees, they come here, but half of them drowned on the way, and you don't want to be very nice to them because you never wanted them there, and they never wanted to come to the island anyway, or to your country. But imagine these people walking around the town, if they're allowed, and see that the only ruins that are really in derelict condition are the mosques and the remains of the Ottoman heritage of the island. Northern Ireland, which was Ottoman until 100 years ago.
Actually, I know the case very well because I both come from Chios and Lesbos. I'm half and half. So the effort of antiquities, which is the state department, which I don't know.
Archaeological service.
Yeah, of the archaeological service is the same in the two islands. And it used to be the Byzantine department in Chios and the classical in Lesbos, and now they're together. So, for example, in Chios, I know very well because my mother works in the effort of antiquities. The Ottoman, for example, mosque is really in a very good. It has been restored. It has been turned to a museum. The locals didn't like that at all, and they think that it is some kind of a trigger to the Turks to come and take it back or something. But what is really interesting, I mean, that has also to do with money and programs, and it does not depend to the public, because if it was up to the public, any of this would have been existing nowadays. But also I think a problem is that Greeks associate Ottomans with Turks, and they associate Ottoman culture with Turkish culture, which is, it doesn't exist.
I would like to add something to this. I have visited Lesbos 2 summers ago, and I was at the beginning, wow, is it really? I was like that. But in 2 seconds, that disappeared in my mind. I mean, seeing the Ottoman mosque being renovated. It was like the biggest construction renovation work. So I immediately thought, because it is in the close vicinity to the Turkish Aegean coast, and the majority of the tourists visiting these islands close to Turkey come from Turkey.
Sure, yes. So did you say that there was a restoration work for the mosque in Mytilene?
Yes, there was.
Actually,
okay.
There are a lot of Ottoman. I mean, there is a mosque. There are 2 mosques. So maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, but for instance, in Rhodos, there was not. I mean, they were falling apart, the cemetery and the small mosque, because Rhodos is more like a European destination in comparison to Chios and Mytilene. So tourism counts.
Well, good news is, at least it is good news that they're restoring the mosque in Lesbos, because when I saw it in Mytilene, it was falling apart. So perhaps now a final word from our lecturer this afternoon before we take a break, a very short break until 1:15, when Bettina will give us the second lecture.
Summarizing the discussion is, for many years, for 2 centuries, Greece was trying to rely and promote monoculturalism. Now, obviously, for all sorts of reasons, it has to acknowledge multiculturalism. And therefore, there are some steps towards acknowledging multiculturalism. And you could see that in one incident, since you mentioned the islands. I was on the island of Rhodes a few years ago, and then I identified a cemetery, and I couldn't find it on the map. What is this cemetery? And this was an Ottoman cemetery. And I found 2 people conversing. One was a Muslim, and the other one was an Italian. And they were conversing in Italian because they both were educated before the Chinese became part of Greece. So you could see the multiculturalism in one incident. And I think it's important to highlight that. But the map was not showing that this was an Ottoman cemetery. And I think that under pressure, these things are changing. And we'll see more reference to the mosques, cemeteries, as well as other monuments from different periods.
So, thank you, everyone. We meet again 15 minutes past the hour for the last lecture for today and more discussion. Thank you, Professor Tziovas. We'll see you tomorrow, obviously. I don't know if you're welcome, of course, to stay with us if you like for the rest of the day, and see you all in 20 minutes or so.
Thank you. Thank you.
Interesting. The warrior that wasn't, the interplay between politics and the archaeology of gender. So we all look forward to that.
Okay, thank you very much. And let's see if we can get this going. So we're going to be
sorry,
moving.
Professor Bettina, Arnold, your voice is very low. Is it possible
Okay.
that you can turn it off, on higher?
Hold on just a second. This should actually not be happening because I'm pretty sure. Does it sound bad still?
It doesn't sound bad. It sounds a bit
It sounds
low.
low. It's not bad, but it sounds as if you're sort of
Okay.
the noise level is reduced.
Yeah. Let me just. How's that?
That's perfect.
Is that better?
Yeah, or if you could be better, if you could be closer to your mic. That's
I think what's happened is that I think it's shifted again away from the mic I had before.
Okay.
Just 1 second here. Let me just check something out. Yeah, I'm not sure. That may have been already the case before, and I wish I had known that. I could have tried to manipulate it. One second. It should actually be using this system though. Is that any better?
Slightly.
Slightly better, but not much better. Okay.
I think, and it's better, I think, because you're closer to your mic right now.
I'll try to be as close as I can be, and
okay.
That'll help.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you for letting me know. So we're going to be shifting now from some of the more overt examples of the impact of the political and archaeological research that we've been hearing about over the last 2 days to what I would argue is a more subversive and pervasive example of identity politics, specifically how gender is represented not only in academic archaeology, but in the media and in museum contexts as well. So let me get the slideshow started here. And start with this image. So, and this is also a little bit of a response to the question that came up yesterday about the extent to which we should be maybe using our position as scholars in sort of advocacy rather than simply passively producing data or information to be manipulated by others. And I obviously do feel that under certain circumstances, we have an obligation to use the platform that's been provided to us in order to engage in some form of public intellectual discourse. And gender happens to be one of the areas where I think I've probably been most active with respect to that aspect of what I think that obligation represents. And in particular, because there's such an obvious connection between past and present when it comes to the way that gender has been politicized. And obviously the example that I use here, the fact that in August of 2020 in the United States, we, if you can say, celebrated the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, even without the passage still of the Equal Rights Amendment. That date obviously was then followed by the election of, for the first time, a woman as vice president. And obviously, if you do the math on this, what that means is effectively it took a century for a woman to enter the White House as anything other than the spouse of a president or vice president. So one of the questions I have, and we can discuss this after I'm done with the presentation, is there any way in which archaeological research being carried out on gender configurations, whether that's explicit or not, in the past contribute to the conversation about why achieving gender parity is taking so long. And this is a question that I've had my students ask me quite frequently. And the other question is, how do current interpretations of past gender systems reflect assumptions about the nature of sex, gender, and power today? So just briefly, in order to kind of put this in some larger perspective, obviously we're talking here about a fairly extensive and long history. And we certainly don't have time today to get into all of the details of the origins of what has been referred to as the androcentric lens. But there's not much question that, at least in terms of European archaeology, a significant element has to be the basis on which a lot of these ideas have kind of developed and then been projected into the past, including obviously Roman law, which viewed the head of the family as quite literally having power over all the individuals within it, power of life and death over the individuals within it. And obviously also the so-called Abrahamic religious traditions, the so-called Big Three, where we have a similar kind of attitude toward these very fixed roles to be assigned to men and women, including the idea that males have authority within the family and by extension the state, and requiring procreation for sexually active women. Now, the impact of the androcentric lens manifests itself in two ways: implicit bias and what we refer to as the binary bind. Implicit bias in this sense literally means that this is something, this particular kind of attitude, again, based on these assumptions, are so baked into the way we view the world around us now as well as in the past, that we effectively don't recognize the possibility that there might be instead of two sort of categories where sex and gender effectively map on one another in a way that restricts them both, i.e. there's only a dichotomous way of viewing sex and gender, and you either belong to the one category or to the other, and this is the binary bind referred to here. And what that means is, in terms of archaeological interpretation, it forecloses the possibility that there might be variations from this type of binary categorization system in the archaeological record. In other words, we're less likely to see it because these implicit biases are unrecognized in ourselves. And there's a lot of research on this, in sort of contemporary discourse. Again, I don't have time to get into that. I think an ancillary element here is the reluctance as a result of these other sorts of pervasive ideas about gender and the limitations specifically of the so-called biological imperative to recognize pathways to power that are not tied to violence or martial prowess in the archaeological record. And this is especially manifested in a focus on higher status individuals and how they may have achieved those roles. And that in turn means there's a reluctance to accept the possibility that women might occasionally have achieved positions of high status and influence in their own right, that is, not as male appendages or male surrogates. And of course, finally, the politicization of archaeological interpretation along gender lines, again, with this binary bind being sort of the dominant paradigm, especially in high-profile sites of international significance. And this is where I'm going to turn to A Tale of Four Tumuli. All of these are central chamber burials. They're all high-status graves. The first of these to be discovered, the site of Vix was discovered in the 1950s, happened to actually contain a biologically female individual. But the main point here, and obviously I'm not expecting any of you to have a background in Iron Age archaeology, isn't so much about the objects found within these burials or the far-flung political connections that are represented by the imports and the wealth that's manifested in these graves. The important point here really is that we're dealing with a relatively rare phenomenon in terms of the burial record. Very few of the burials that are found at the bottom, at the base of these large mounds are unlooted. These four really at this point represent sort of our primary database, and it's pretty clearly not statistically significant. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Not to mention that how representative these burials are of gender configurations writ large versus, again, just focusing on elites is also an open question. So it's important to keep in mind, though, and this is sort of a potted history now, very brief overview of what we have access to in terms of evidence for this period. We do not have written records. So for those of you working in the Mediterranean world, this is obviously a pretty significant difference. We have nothing really to fall back on apart from very unreliable Greek and Roman sources, which again, that's another, kind of presentation of a different kind. There's also not very much iconographic evidence in most areas of early Iron Age West Central Europe, at least. So most of the evidence that we have about gender configurations comes from mortuary context. And some of the few examples, these are actually both from the same part of Southwest Germany. You can see here the stela on the left and then the couch panel on the right. So the burial record has obvious problems as a primary source of information, especially if it's the main one in this case, when it comes to gender configurations. But on the other hand, in the absence of these other sources, written records, iconographic evidence, it does have some benefits. One of them being that when preservation is good, you at least have the skeletal remains. So you have something against which you can test your gender assumptions based on the grave goods. And it helps as well that this society actually did conceive of some form of an afterlife that, if it wasn't identical to this life, was at least a reflection of it in some significant ways. In other words, they're quite literally conceptualizing the burial chambers of these high status individuals almost as domestic spaces, as small sort of microcosm versions of the home or the house, with objects of power obviously displayed prominently, including drinking vessels, often four-wheeled vehicles in the early period, and then two-wheeled chariots in the later period, probably manifesting some form of journey to the afterlife in a literal sense. So that's obviously helpful. Also, we have evidence from the mortuary record of differentiation between the central chamber graves, obviously, and the burials found usually above and around those central burials, and in the form of cemeteries. So we have lineage, probably other types of social units represented. Much of this is at this point still largely unreconstructed information. That is, we because of the emphasis on these high status graves, know much less about the overall sort of social structure than we would like to, but it's clear that communities are represented in some form, or subsets of communities. And that includes individual mounds as well as mound cemeteries, like the one you can see in the lower left here. I already mentioned the fact that these central chamber burials are often looted for obvious reasons. You put a giant earth pile on top of what is clearly going to end up being a sort of container for lots of high status goodies made of gold and other imports. You might as well put a big sign over the top saying, "Loot me." So that's basically what happened, not just in the 19th century, but interestingly also apparently in some cases shortly after these mounds were actually constructed, which is a separate kind of topic and an interesting one in and of itself. So we don't know precisely what percentage of the original sort of population of these mounds has come down to us. Obviously, there's been a lot of damage from other contexts, destructive contexts like agricultural activity, but we do think that we have at least a representative sample of what was once present. It gets a bit more complicated when you start looking at the actual grave goods that are found in these mounds. We do see pretty clear evidence that the body itself served as a kind of walking billboard for a whole range of different kinds of social identities being used to mark gender, among other things, but also very clearly marital status, probably reproductive success, social role, what are these individuals actually doing in life, social status, again, separate from that. Context-dependent dress is tricky. There's a bit of a debate right now about the extent to which what we see in the burial actually reflects what was worn in daily life. And part of the reason that I'm more willing to come down on the idea that what we're seeing in the graves is actually partly, at least, a costume that would have been worn on a daily basis, mainly comes from evidence for repairs and for wear on particular costume elements, things like bracelets, for example, which there's now evidence to suggest were frequently put on at a very young age and then could literally not have been removed as women in particular became adults. The same thing is true for some of the belt ensembles. We don't have a lot of grave good categories, interestingly, that are exclusively associated with one biological sex or the other when sexable remains are present. The exceptions include weapons, razors, and ankle rings, that is actual ornament in the sort of foot part of the body, or the ankles specifically. What seems to be more important is where on the body the objects are found, how many of the objects there are, and what combinations they're found in. So that constitutes a very rapid overview of what we're looking at in terms of body-bound sort of marking of gender. But significantly, equally important, age, and again, chronological versus social age here seems to have actually been the primary identity sort of marker, the one that actually even more important than gender, quite frankly. And it impacted not just the way that the individual was costumed, but also whether they were buried at all and in what type of context. Also, of course, we're missing a tremendous amount of information in terms of perishable materials that just haven't preserved. Probably things like hairstyle, body modification, textiles, definitely. We see more and more evidence of that now because we're looking for it, which means that in the past we've sort of missed it. It's important too to keep in mind that generally speaking, men tend to be less easy to see archaeologically, that is males specifically, because if they don't have weapons in the graves, generally speaking, the quantity of imperishable or inorganic, especially metal grave goods, tends to be much more limited. Women are quite literally loaded down. One of my German colleagues calls these, my Christmas trees. They're wearing this enormous amount of head ornament, often, waist ornament. They're just much more visible archaeologically, and it's not because they were more important. It's because they had more metal literally on their bodies than males, and because weapons are only found in a very small percentage of male burials, and the same thing is true for razors. Okay, so in general, of course, as is true for an awful lot of other archaeological contexts, many of the early interpretations of these high status burials, because again, they're sort of subjected to the overall sociocultural context within which archaeological research is conducted. Not surprisingly, we're seeing largely androcentric interpretations of these graves, and Vix is no exception. This again was the first of these unlooted central chamber burials to be discovered in the 1950s. You can see the dates there. It's about 500 to about 450 BC. It was quite literally the most spectacular burial of its kind that had been found up to that point. And for those of you that do have a background in Mediterranean archaeology, what you're looking at there is actually the rim of an enormous crater. It's about 5.5 feet high. It's the only object of this type that's actually come down to us from the Greek world. Apparently the ones that existed in Greece in probably also mortuary contexts as well as in settlement contexts were melted down evidently. So this one is preserved because it was actually exported to this area of France near the Seine River at the hill fort site of Monassois in Burgundy. So the significance then was clear from the beginning. This spectacular imported object, obviously, you can see it here in terms of scale, together with the other objects that were found in the grave. It was a sensation when it was first found. And the initial morphological analysis of the skeleton indicated that it was likely a female individual. But there was a significant amount of resistance, at least in some quarters, to the interpretation of this obviously very powerful person as a person of influence in her own right, and not necessarily as a result of being, again, a manifestation of the appendage syndrome, the wife, or in other ways related to a high status male individual. So, again, 30 to 35 years of age here. Significant point is there were no weapons found in the burial. Ankle rings were actually present, which is one of the few types of sort of exclusive female gender categories of personal ornament in this particular period. The material lignite, jet and jet-like kinds of materials, typically is also associated with female graves of lower status, less commonly found in male graves. That's significant as well. The pattern here of taking the wheels off the wagon box and putting the body on it separately, while this particular manifestation is usually found in female graves, not all female burials show that particular pattern. But this again indicated pretty clearly that the most parsimonious interpretation of this grave, in fact, was that it was that of a very important, powerful female individual. And you can see some close-up shots here. The torque, the gold neck ring, again, a high status marker in Iron Age Central Europe generally, also an imported piece, spectacular object, Attic pottery. This is one of the handle terminals from the crater. What's interesting is that both on the calyx here and on the crater, the imagery is actually very martial, even though the individual in question was not buried with weapons. And I'd like to just propose that our fixation on this idea that, you know, martial imagery and or weapons in these sorts of contexts probably should not be viewed solely from a functional perspective. That is, even the absence of weapons here, but the presence of martial imagery might have more to do with the symbolic role of this individual as a protector and a leader, rather than the actual physical sort of engagement in violent interactions in some form. And I think that's probably as true for some of the male burials as it is for the female ones. Now, not too surprisingly, one of the ways in which this resistance to the interpretation of Vix as a high status female individual manifested itself was in some pretty significant mental gymnastics on the part of one archaeologist in particular, Konrad Spindler, who in the 1980s apparently was just so disturbed by the idea that this grave actually represented a high status female individual with, you know, again, all of these clear sort of trade connections and other manifestations of power, that he single-handedly invoked a new category of persons. Specifically, he attempted to reinterpret the burial as that of a transvestite male priest. Okay, that was the way he got around the problem of dealing with a woman in a position of power, which is interesting considering that at the time, at least, nobody was talking about transgender individuals in prehistory or anything else. That apparently he was more willing to accept that possibility than the alternative and more parsimonious explanation that, you know, we're dealing with a woman here who's just a very important person. Now, what he had to conclude, though, that as a result of his interpretation, that there might be a way for an individual in this society to achieve this kind of paramount position without necessarily serving in a martial capacity, that is being, you know, viewed as a warrior or a war leader for their population. And that was an important contribution, even though his interpretation is entirely erroneous. So it's worth noting that. We see the same kind of narrative actually is still associated with the Vix, you know, kind of burial in various contexts. Again, I'm not going to get into too much of this because we don't have a lot of time. The second burial here that I'd like to mention was also, in this case, the next one to be discovered, turned out actually to be a biologically male based on the morphological markers on the skeleton individual. And really quite different from Vix in a number of respects. It's a bit earlier in date, not that that's necessarily that important. Both of them were mature adults, but in this case, we do have the full sort of complement of weaponry. So we have a dagger, in this case with a gold sheath found actually on the body. There's also some implements, including a knife and an axe associated with the feasting equipment, very large cauldron. Not as spectacular, obviously, as the crater and Vix, but still a lot of the same elements. Four-wheeled wagons there, drinking and feasting equipment is there, but this time with the weapons, and obviously in this case, the individual laid out on this really spectacular sheet bronze couch. Oddly enough, there are some other things about it that also suggest, though, that the weapons found, so including the dagger and the bow and arrow, may have been more symbolic than functional. So the dagger is actually not that impressive as a weapon. Sorry about that, I just advanced a little too fast. And the bow and arrow clearly, you know, in this particular case is more likely to be symbolic than a weapon of war. Oddly, Iron Age Europeans really don't seem to have engaged much in archery. They don't seem to have used weapons of this type in warfare. It's not clear if that's because they saw that as cowardly, because you're killing at a distance, you're not eye to eye. They had, again, this is partly interpreted based on much later sources, but the notion of single combat and, you know, kind of not necessarily pitched battles means that the whole way they might have viewed violent interactions of that kind was different anyway, which is a separate kind of question. But in any case, in this particular instance, at least, the other type of weapon that we frequently find in the less spectacularly outfitted burials, spears, fully functional, are not present. So that's important. The next burial actually does contain weapons of that kind, and this is a bit later in date now, 5th century BC, and I'm actually presenting them to you in the order in which they were found because the way they're interpreted is to some extent significant. The previous grave with Hochdorf, the Hochdorf prince, so-called, again, partly as a result of the ambiguity of the weapons as actual sort of evidence of martial prowess, and partly due to other aspects of the grave goods, has been interpreted as a kind of priest-king. So that aspect of Spindler's original interpretation was sort of held over from the Wick's interpretation as well. With the Glauberg, it's a little easier to make the case that you're actually looking at an individual here, outfitted with spears, with a shield, with again, a spectacular sword. Bow and arrow and quiver is still there, but with fewer arrows than in the Hochdorf grave. High status individual, again, represented by the gold torque here, drinking equipment. So all of the same sorts of elements are present. But in this case, the martial prowess element is definitely much more sort of clearly manifested than in the previous two burials. So the idea that this individual might have had, some sort of role to play in terms of being a war leader has also been sort of posited. However, the statue, the sculpture that was found in association with this grave was paralleled in the burial itself, in the central chamber grave, by this rather odd head covering. There's a reconstruction in the lower left. And that in turn has meant that this notion of a sort of ritual capacity in which these individuals might have sort of manifested their power is held over in this grave also. So that means all three of them up to that point have that particular kind of association. Now, Lavaux in Burgundy, 2014, is the most recent discovery. And this is the one I'd like to focus a little bit more attention on, because it was a rescue project. And I have to say that the excavators did a pretty amazing job, considering that they were not expecting to find something, of this significance. Here's Bastien Dubuis, together with Émilie Millet, the primary excavators of the grave. The main sort of feature of the burial that's really significant is the massive amount of drinking equipment made of sheep bronze, some of it, again, imported pretty clearly from the Mediterranean world. But what was interesting from the perspective of anyone who's following the whole gender politics kind of piece of this in terms of Iron Age archaeology was that from the beginning, there were some odd features with respect to the grave goods. So there were no weapons that could be identifiably associated with the body, that is not on the body itself, which is where you saw the previous examples, the daggers always being borne, the spears are over the left shoulder. There was only one implement that could have been interpreted as a weapon in this grave. It was a knife, and it was hanging on the wall significant distance from the actual body itself. So that's number one. The gold neck ring, again, males and females both are found with the neck ring as a high status marker, although gold torques of that type usually are found in male graves. In the earlier period, by the time you get to this period, by the early La Tène, they're found in both men's and women's graves. Less clearly interpretable is the fact that we have bracelets found on both wrists. That is, symmetrical jewelry is one of and particularly ring jewelry on the lower arms, is one of the few consistent markers of biologically female individuals, even of lower status. And so when this was discovered in combination with the relatively robust morphological features exhibited by the skull and the pelvic region, it caused some consternation, especially in the absence of the presence of any weapons. Also, there's an upper arm ring here made of lignite. So again, the material reads female, but one of the other, it's somewhat, how to put it, it's not exclusive as a gender marker, but when you do have bracelets, as for example in the case of some of the paramount elite status graves in male burials, they're usually on only one arm, typically the left arm, either on the wrist, or if they're not on the wrist, they're going to be above the elbow. And that above the elbow position is something you only find in male graves, never in female ones. So just one bicep ring, essentially. So we have a bicep ring, which reads male, but a material that reads female. We have two gold bracelets in position, symmetrically worn, that reads female. Morphologically, this is a very ambiguous burial. And the weapons are simply not present that you would expect to see, the kind of thing that you certainly do see in the Glauberg burial, which is roughly contemporary, although it's in Germany and not in France. So Lavaux, again, very close to Wick's, but very different from Wick's in a number of important respects. The one thing, again, that connects them is the massive amount or the massive emphasis on drinking and feasting equipment. Okay, so there's that lignite upper armoring. The most recent evidence, and I have to say too that this burial, in terms of its interpretation, it's been very difficult to get information about what was actually found in it. Some of it had to do with the fact that there wasn't that much funding, I think, available for actual restoration, but there's now, again, there's still no DNA evidence, and I would suggest that they might consider doing that in spite of the morphological indicators of maleness, just because you can't rule out the possibility that, you know, we're dealing with a robust but female individual, and it would be best, I think, to resolve that, which they did do with Vix after Spindler's initial kind of interpretation. There is a claim that there was a wicker helmet found in the crook of the arm. I'll show you the terminal in a moment. That one's still kind of an open question. The chariot wheels were removed apparently from the body, although that's also kind of, I've seen two different versions of that. And I already mentioned the business with the bracelets. Also, just for what it's worth, the style of neck ring is very similar to gold neck rings that are typically found in female graves, but again, in the Rhineland region. Now, I got involved in all of this because I have written a bit about Vix and about this whole possibility of supernumerary gender categories in these earlier societies. And by that, I want to emphasize, I'm not talking about, you know, kind of trans individuals the way we might refer to them in modern discourse. It's more about gender fluidity, or at least the possibility that there might have been a spectrum, not two boxes, but, you know, kind of two ends of the spectrum certainly exist. But that within that and particularly possibly for elite individuals of a certain kind, there's clearly more ambiguous kind of set of markers. And that was why I was asked to contribute to the initial sort of story arc for a video that ultimately was produced by Alte and was actually shown in both France and Germany. I don't know where else it might have been broadcast in 2014. So I spent a lot of time talking to the writer, Jonas Rosales, who was really interested in this whole question of gender fluidity and whether or not that was present here. And because I had also been asked to give some comments on other manifestations of this type of gender ambiguity in other earlier contexts, he reached out to me. So I was happy to provide that. And then eventually I got involved with the actual making of the film. This is the film crew and the directors over there on the left. And it was all happy, clappy, and really great. And I spent a lot of time talking about, you know, this whole business of gender ambiguity, and they used none of it in the film. They completely got rid of it. The only thing they kept was the bit where I talk about what, you know, kind of the binary kind of ends of the spectrum, but the middle totally ignored it. So they opted to not include it. And part of the reason was that the narrative they were presenting was solely fixated on this idea that this burial was a warrior grave. And this was what the media picked up on, and it was the only thing you saw in terms of what was broadcast out there in sort of the general public. And I was hugely disappointed, as was Jonas Rosales, I might add, because honestly, I mean, the helmet, which, you know, may or may not actually be a helmet, you can see the artist there has actually placed it right here in this position, but in the earlier images, you can't see any evidence of that. The fact that the only quote unquote weapon is over here on the wall, again, that there's been no DNA analysis whatsoever. You know, again, this implicit gender bias, the immediate kind of fallback to this notion that a leader must be somehow associated with a sort of martial role in this society. That was the narrative that they wanted to present. And there was a significant amount of that actually, again, mostly on the part of the French archaeologists in the film. Now I'm gonna skip over this, we've already kind of covered it. Here's actually that so-called helmet terminal with some additional strap attachments. And I should add that iron was poorly preserved in this burial generally, which makes it hard to really say much about this piece. This is not the helmet from Lavaux. This is a helmet from a different context from Agri. Roughly, it's a little later, but it's roughly the same style, presumably not quite as elongated. But I'm mainly showing it just to give you a sense of what the terminal might be, if that's in fact what this is. So there are other possibilities, however, for what this object might be, and that's worth noting. And then here's the knife, which is actually significant size for what that's worth. And the reason I mention it is because in the reconstruction, you can see they actually have him wearing it, which he was not doing in the grave, right? This is the putative individual represented. And there you can see it on the wall in the reconstruction. And this is actually from an exhibition catalog that was published in 2018. And it's about as close at this point as they've come to actually providing a sort of catalog of the objects that were actually found in the burial. For a long time, there was only information really about the drinking vessels, and those were the sort of main focus. Now, I don't want to make it sound as though, I'm dumping on the Lavaux grave, because that's not the case. I think this is a pervasive problem, and it's actually associated with a whole range of associated problems when it comes to the way that the media in particular, and to some extent we're complicit in this, in the same way that Susanne was making the point, it's a symbiotic relationship. We give them information, they don't necessarily always kind of misuse it intentionally, but it's also true that they cherry pick it. And then we're not always able after the fact to really influence the way that it's presented. So, the fact that there's definitely age bias, there's sexist bias, there's elitist bias is all out there. Even, I would argue, body image sort of bias. I mean, this is a classic case. This was that burial I was talking about yesterday that was excavated in the Danube Plain. Very, very, large central chamber grave with 2 women in it, by the way, also an interesting phenomenon. One of them very richly outfitted, and you can see that here. But I can tell you that the belt plate that they've represented here in this svelte kind of very Parisian style, runway kind of imagery is actually significantly wider than that. They've had to Photoshop it so that they've given her a waist. And it's, again, a mature female individual, probably late 30s, early 40s, something along those lines. This is not at all what kind of you would have seen if you could have seen her in the flesh. And a very similar kind of issue arose when a colleague of mine in Switzerland, Brigitte Rüder, attempted to present what she saw as a more accurate representation of these high status female individuals, mature women essentially, that seem to have been, serving a particular kind of social role in these societies. This is her interpretation of what one of these leaders, giver of feasts, ritual specialists might have looked like. And there's the quote I got from her in an email. I got complaints that she was too old, too ugly, and too masculine. Okay, so again, this projection of our ideas about what constitutes kind of female attractiveness, but more importantly, even sort of pushing back against the idea that women can take on these positions and roles without this hypersexualized kind of notion of femininity that we seem to be still sort of plagued with today. There have been some correctives. One of the more positive media experiences that I've had recently was actually just broadcast this past October. And this was a film that was produced by Austrian television under the aegis of the so-called Universum label. And it's the first time I've ever been involved in a project where every single part of the process, that is director, producer, archaeologist, consultant, everyone involved, they were all women. And the emphasis in this case, or the focus, was on the salt mine of Hallstatt specifically, but with reference to a high status burial from Mittelkirchen in Austria. And you can see the woman here on the left, the actress, wearing this really fabulous fur kind of mantle with bronze studs on it. There's actually a kind of corresponding elaborate trim at the base, which you can't see in the image here. You can see the director and the archaeologists involved here, or rather filmmakers, on the lower right, and then the reconstruction in the mines at Hallstatt in the upper left. And the main reason that this was so refreshing was that they focused on the society as a whole, the whole spectrum here. The possibility of women taking on important sort of roles was front and center, but more importantly, they focused on the way that the family as an economic unit would have functioned in this particular context. So instead of overemphasizing, kind of one gender at the expense of the other, they really were representing, or trying to represent, something that would have been, I think, much more of a reflection of what the societies would have actually been like. So how am I doing on time? So gender differentiation, then, I'd like to argue, and this is an important, kind of takeaway, that if nothing else, we need to communicate effectively, or more effectively, and as frequently as possible when we interact with the media, is that it doesn't necessarily imply gender inequality. That's another really common misconception. It typically arises as soon as you start talking about these kinds of highly politicized issues. that gender ambiguity and fluidity may have been institutionalized and sanctioned in the past, even if that's not the case today, again, as a result of the Judeo-Christian tradition and Roman law and all the other sorts of kinds of stereotypes and assumptions that are derived from our own sort of our largely Western European way of thinking about gender. Multiple pathways to power apparently existed in many of these prehistoric societies, and not all of them were based on martial prowess or physical ability. And then that charismatic ritual practitioners, as one of the sort of options for this type of role, may have been mediating between the world of the living and the supernatural in life, as well as after death, as indicated at least. And I'd like to make a plug as well for completely rejecting this simplistic idea that when you have weapons in a burial, they necessarily mean the presence of a warrior, because this completely ignores the multivocality of objects. First of all, the fact that the mortuary context itself transforms objects in important ways, and that we're missing potentially some really interesting ways in which material culture served as kind of metaphorical signifiers. And then this idea that implicit gender bias, which we certainly still suffer from today, and the way that we view the relationship between gender and power, that is necessarily innate and immutable, I think also needs to be rejected. So I think in that sense, Iron Age societies and other prehistoric societies where we have similar kinds of patterns may have something to teach us. So that, I believe, let me see. Yes, so that's just the final inspirational quote after the election of, I keep saying the election of Kamala Harris. Poor Biden gets short shrift there, but anyway, yes. And that is it for me.
Thank you very much for this reminder, very, very useful and very important reminder that we should not be satisfied with identifying a one-to-one relationship between finds and ideas, that they don't always come. Now, I almost forgot this break too, but I did not. Okay, it's the first time this happens to me in this workshop. Right. So there's plenty of time, I think. Would you like to have a break, Bettina? Now,
I'm fine. If you would like to have a break, I'm fine with that.
Do you want to type your question? In the meantime, let's hear from Zenta, and Ivo will type his question.
Yes, I have a question about the Vic's burial. So I was wondering if this archaeologist Spindler it was, did he really say somewhere that no, it can't be a woman? Like, did he explicitly said that it can't be a woman at any cost? And also, is he talking about more about this trans person thing? What he thinks about this? Does he means it is a woman or it is a man who is cross-dressing as a woman? And what is his notions about it? Because it sounds like it's really progressive of him to mention this idea. So I wouldn't see a problem there also. But yeah, what was his intentions behind this more, maybe?
Right. No, this is what makes it so ironic, actually, that it does appear very progressive, but in fact, it's the opposite. So, and when he calls it transvestite, he literally he's not even talking about, transgender the way we would use the term. He literally means a biologically male individual wearing female clothing, presumably as a way of communicating the ability to connect with the supernatural world, that this notion of sort of, having to step outside or be outside of a particular kind of biological, association with sex, by taking on that female role, he's in theory then able to serve as this conduit between his community and whatever there is up in this numinous, kind of environment that would allow that communication to take place, which, as you say, I mean, it sounds sounds fine. I mean, there's no problem necessarily with the idea of a ritual practitioner. And in fact, there are plenty of examples of that, various societies where you have shamanic traditions that require individuals to be sort of in a liminal state. It's neither male nor female. It's actually a third gender, which actually would have been a more progressive way for him to approach it if he had thought about it. But I mean, honestly, I think this quite literally was a case of invoking an entirely new category of leadership, but as a way of disenfranchising women specifically. That, I mean, the fact that he doesn't come out explicitly saying there's no way that a woman would have been able to take this kind of role. He doesn't need to. It's the whole article in which he makes this case is basically an exercise in special pleading for that particular outcome. In other words, that, you know, all these other things are more likely than that this would be a woman, a female individual. And he did also invoke the, at the time, the morphological markers, not unlike Lavaux, actually, I might add. So it's a similar thing. The robusticity of the Vix skeleton was one of the things that he pointed to as a way of rationalizing, you know, why he thought it was a biologically male individual, which is why they then carried out the DNA analysis that confirmed that in fact it was a biologically female individual, and everything then was consistent from the gender perspective, quote unquote, in terms of the absence of weapons and all the rest of it. He never actually publicly retracted that interpretation, by the way. So that's kind of an interesting point, even though he was still alive when the final sort of verdict came down. But I mean, I don't know if Susanne knows much about him, but the background there in terms of other information about him suggests very strongly to me that actually, yes, the main reaction was just, you know, about as anti the idea of a woman in power as you can imagine. That just made him very nervous. Anything else would be better than that, essentially.
Oh, yeah. Or certainly sexist and transphobic. Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
Thank you.
Yes.
We got a question from Ivo. Considering recent global anti-gender campaigns, including attacks against gender studies, have your work in gender aspects of archaeology and heritage been affected somehow by political funding or scholarly actors beyond media?
Yes, so that's a very good question. Not affected in the sense of my not being able to get funding or any threat to my job. And I almost hesitate to even raise this, but I have to say that it's come from my colleagues in gender studies primarily. That's been based on the fact that I'm still convinced that distinguishing between sex and gender is important, rather than simply making the statement that they're both culturally constructed and so therefore should not be separated. And that alone was enough to pretty much, if I say blackball, that doesn't really make a lot of sense from a gender or biological sex perspective, but they really did they sent me to Coventry is what the English say. Because of that. And I'm not the only scholar who is in that situation, who's, you know, kind of coming out of a biological anthropology / you know, kind of more processual archaeology background and viewing both of those sources of information as distinctly different in that context. And for me, it's not so much about gender politics today and projecting those into the past. It's more about being able to demonstrate that there were constructions of gender and gender ideologies in the past that are less constraining than what we have now. I think that's the message we should be sending. I think trying to assume that people would have thought about gender the way we do now, and if you're not representing that in your research, then you're somehow, you know, you're betraying some sort of contemporary political agenda. I have a real problem with that, and that has been, I mean, to some extent, it's just meant that I'm not cited anymore by certain people, and they don't invite me to conferences. It's more a way of sort of shutting people out or shunning them, not in any direct sense affecting my research. But, you know, I mean, it is important, I think, to stress that the media role in all of this is not inconsiderable. And I say that on both ends of this, not just, you know, in terms of what happened with the Lavaux representation in the film, but also in this particular case. So the question that you're asking here, I find that especially for younger scholars, it's really risky territory. And, you know, I mean, it's one thing for me, I'm established, there's nothing they can really do to me, but it's very difficult to push the boat out if you're, you know, kind of vulnerable, and you're more likely to then, as they say, go along to get along. And I think anytime, you know, that kind of dialogue starts to develop around a particular topic, you're running into difficulties. That's why I say this is a political issue. It's not necessarily solely, you know, an archaeological issue or an issue that relates to defining or, you know, kind of identifying sex differences in skeletal populations, or however you want to put it. So that's a very good question.
Oh yes, it is a political issue because, and we were discussing about this yesterday at some point, I think, peer review and also project review. It's very easy, and I say this as one of the guys who actually do the review from time to time. It's very easy to just slash a project, and because you don't like the agenda, and this is always political. There's nothing academic about it. It's always political. Clary, and then Miglena, and then Cosmin, and then Juana.
As you noted at the end of your great presentation, I feel that there is a tendency in archaeology to objectify the people of the past by removing aspects of their everyday life. I mean, it's obvious that the fact that someone carries a blade doesn't mean that he didn't have a social life or a sexual life or whatever. Why do you think that only such glories, if war can be described as a glory nowadays, are emphasized when the majority of people can easier identify with aspects of everyday life?
That's a very good question as well. And to be honest with you, I can't quite answer it. I was very surprised by the way that the film was literally sort of mutilated after the fact. And I think I mentioned that the writer, Jonas Rosales, was equally, he actually tried to intervene directly with INRAP. My understanding, and this was the way Jonas represented it to me, so I can't say that I have any, it's not like I have documentary evidence of this, but this was coming from a government-funded organization. I don't know what the motivation might have been there, why, you know, this particular, the burial was in the news constantly. It was hugely important, obviously, as a discovery. And I don't know, they clearly wanted it to represent a certain image of, you know, kind of how power was constructed in that context. So but it's difficult for me. I can't obviously say definitively that that's what was happening there. On the other hand, it's worth noting, I mean, Timothy Earle is an American archaeologist who's actually worked in Hawaii as well as in Denmark, and he's now retired, but he spent a lot of time focusing on the way in which especially anthropological concepts influence archaeology. And Alec, I think you were the one who briefly referenced yesterday there was a moment in time here in the United States where a number of departments of archaeology attempted to sort of split off from larger cultural anthropology programs. Sometimes they took biological anthropology with them because they viewed that as sort of more close to what they were doing, and sometimes not. In most cases, they didn't succeed very well, but not because of sort of intellectual issues. That I think that particular problem, the you know, association, especially with, how to put it, using models derived from ethnographic context is part of this also. And Earle had, there's an essay of his, and I see if I can find it, I'll send it around, where he talks about the sort of foundations of power. And he talks about what he calls the 4 Fs, that all power in societies can be derived from these 4 sources: faith, for obvious reasons, so religious or ideological kind of basis; funding, so there's always going to be some kind of whatever economic, you know, kind of argument; fascination, which is his word for what we'd call charismatic leadership. What's the 4th? Faith, funding, fascination, and fear, which is the violence piece. And that all 4 of those combined are what allow leaders to engage in what he calls the fifth F, which is unprintable. That's what they do to their people, essentially, right? So it's this sort of combined, multi-stranded sort of way of thinking about power. And I think that the reduction of that to just fear is an interesting one. And I don't really know the answer. I don't know why in this particular context, that was what they chose to go with, especially because that burial, I think, has, you could argue you'd be on better grounds than Spindler was with Vix to claim that it's some type of religious practitioner, possibly taking on, you know, a kind of more ambiguous gender role than typically would be seen in some of these other graves. So it's a mystery to me. I find that a much more interesting proposition, even though it's more complicated, and possibly, because we've talked about this too, the whole business of messaging and keeping things simple. If they're too complex, people can't follow. So some of this has to do with the way the media perceives it too, I think. They tend to sort of tune out as soon as you begin to have to explain things too much. They don't want that. Simple explanation, that's what they're going for. But I don't know. It's a good question.
Thank you.
Is it my turn?
I think so.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I don't have a question, only information to share with you that came up during your presentation. So about 20 years ago, Bulgarian archaeologists were used to interpret the gender of disease mainly according to the grave goods.
Right.
For example, when we have weapons, for sure we have a male disease, and when we have jewelry, for sure we have a female one. Recently, anthropological researches are mandatory during our excavations, so it is more easy for the archaeologists regarding the interpretation. But there is an interesting case. In 2004, a big discovery was made in Bulgaria. One of a few unlooted Thracian tombs was discovered. This is the tomb of Celtes III, close to Kazanlak in Голяма Косматка Mount. And it was a really big discovery. In front of the tomb, there was it was found a bronze head, male head, a life size. You will see it on Saturday at the Archaeological Museum. And later it was interpreted as the head of the Thracian king Celtes III. So more than 70 items were found inside the tomb, and belong them, of course, weapons. For example, helmet, greaves, sword, etc. And no human bones except for human teeth. So the interpretation of the gender was more or less in the question. Right. Because of an inscription on the helmet, it was written Celtu, or belong to Celtes. The scholars interpreted this discovery as the tomb of Celtes. But among these grave goods was found silver gilt pyxis. And the question came up, what was this pyxis? Because as we know, the pyxis pack size are mostly female items for keeping cosmetics, jewelry, etc. And was it a personal item or a grave offering? And one of the interpretation was that this is the pixies of Celte's wife, Berenike, and maybe she put it in the grave, in the tomb, in order to replace her presence there. So this was very interesting interpretation, and I think that most of our colleagues accepted it. Thank you.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is, again, the difficulty with the mortuary context is that it's so, the only thing, as one of the, I forget if it's Richard Bradley or Mike Parker Pearson, but one of them says, the only thing you can definitely say about a burial is that it has something to do with a death. I mean, that's anything beyond that is interpretation, right? So that's where it gets complicated. There's no doubt. And the fact that you don't always know, and then of course there's the famous, the dead don't bury themselves. So someone put that object in there, whether, you know, it's a surviving female connected to the individual in the burial or not. Again, there's no way of determining that. So it doesn't, then that's not even getting into the whole business of burials that are opened up and things taken out and put back in again and all the rest of it. So it gets quite complicated. But for me, as far as the multivocality of objects piece is concerned, one of the best examples of that is actually a burial contemporary with some of the ones I talked about from Spain, the Dama de Baza burial, which is in Granada. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this. It's a spectacular, also unlooted burial with a lot of ceramics, a fabulous stone carved throne with a full-size portrait of the woman that was buried in the tomb on it. It's the only well-preserved one of its kind, but others have been found that are fragmentary. Partially cremated remains put in a niche in the throne that they weren't burned so severely that they couldn't be sexed, and evidently it actually is a female individual. But then 3 swords and 3 shields. And I mean, you can make the case that you could maybe use 2 swords at the same time, but 3 swords at the same time suggests something else is going on there in terms of sort of a, again, metaphorical sort of representation. So there are times when at least you can make the case that it's less likely that what you're looking at is a functional association as far as role is concerned. And even then, that's about as far as you're going to be able to go in this particular case, at least. So yes, I'd love to know if there's a publication. You're going to be talking about this this week, the burial that you just referenced?
Yes, I will upload it. I will try to find it now or tomorrow.
Yeah, that's okay. There's no rush, but I'd be interested because that's definitely one of those instances, again, where you have these assemblages that are just, yeah, what do you do?
Yeah.
Thanks.
And Cosmin?
Yes, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. And I think my question related to what you were saying a bit earlier to a previous response as to not to impose our thinking and norms to the Iron Age society in relation to gender, to transgender studies, and so on. So, but still, my question, it might be a naive question, but because you began the presentation with this kind of genealogy of gender roles starting from the Roman times, the Roman law, and then with the Abrahamic religions, could you argue, or it has been argued, that before that time, gender roles were much more fluid and you could much easily maybe talk about things like transgender? Yes, that's it.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. So this is one of those cases where I think archaeologists have potentially the ability to actually communicate some of what we know about gender configurations in the past, and that this break with that earlier way of, you know, kind of configuring social roles, I think needs to be more widely disseminated and understood. In that sense, I think it would definitely be it's the kind of information, in other words, that they would have had the opportunity to present in the Lavaux context in that film, and they chose not to do it, which I found really disappointing, because it would have given an opening for precisely that kind of conversation. Even if all you say is, I mean, even the classical, kind of authors make mention of the fact that whatever's happening north of the Alps when it comes to gender relations, it's really strange and it's different from what we're doing here. That they make that point more than once. So does that translate into, kind of modern gender politics? Not necessarily, but I think it does indicate that the way we view gender, and again, this notion of implicit bias, it's really pervasive, and it's entirely, I would say, or largely uncritically sort of accepted. I mean, most of the time you're not aware it's actually affecting your work at all until you're confronted with it in some way, and then you don't have much choice. So yes, I think the other thing it's worth noting, I mean, the way in which we define gender relations, especially what's referred to as gender identity in sort of contemporary contexts in the West, largely has associations with sort of the choice of sexual partner. And there's good evidence from other contexts, especially ethnographic contexts from this hemisphere. And I'm thinking specifically now of what are referred to as sort of two-spirit people, or sort of alternative gender categories in Native American contexts, where it's pretty clear that who you sleep with was the last thing that mattered. What mattered was what kind of work you did, and who you did it with. In other words, behavior in the everyday context, not sexual relations. So that the way that we're defining it now is not, I think, necessarily the best way to think about it. And that's another whole conversation about why we have this particular perception. But I think that's an important point as well. And the fact that in some cultural contexts, individuals who are, for whatever reason, don't conform to that sort of binary bind, are not necessarily always viewed as somehow marginal. They may actually be viewed as special in a way that is valuable to the community. And again, the ethnographic record suggests that too. So this notion that you might have had individuals in that sort of liminal state that Spindler kind of indicates was possibility is not completely far-fetched. It's just, it needs to be unpacked a whole lot more carefully than he did, and for different reasons. So
thank you.
Yep.
And now it's Juana.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very, very important for me. I remember when I read the first study of archaeology of gender, that it was quite incredible for me, because it's something very new in Romania. It's quite known that we still are shy when we are talking about gender, and in the quite proper way. And a lot of time I was thinking if not the religion was a problem in talking about gender archaeology, and maybe the idea that the Christian idea that the woman is a subject of a man, that it was so important in the ideology in Romania, that it was quite difficult to accept this kind of discoveries like VIX, for example. In my presentation on Friday, I will speak about another problem of genetics studies in Romania, and how problematic they were, especially with the Orthodox Church from Romania. So I was wondering if that happens also in other countries, and if I think when you are talking about sex and gender, sometimes the church and the religion has an important voice. Thank you.
Yes, I agree. And I think that the introduction of Christianity created a massive barrier, actually, when it comes to the way that we conceptualize what these populations were actually like. I mean, genetically, of course, they're like us, I mean, there's no question, but I think they wouldn't have recognized the way we think about the world. And I don't think we would have recognized the way they view it either. I think, and I don't want to give you the idea, by the way, that people had more autonomy back then, or that the extent to which individuals could make choices was like ours today. I don't think that's true either. I think that but I do think that the categories that were open to people were maybe different in a way that's pretty important, and among other things along gender lines. So I just think we need to be careful not to limit ourselves when it comes to how we're thinking about this. And to do that, we have to accept the fact that we are just programmed to think about sex and gender in very specific ways. And those are not immutable or innate, those ways. They are culturally constructed. I mean, there was a film that just aired about a week ago on Nova, on public television here in the United States, called Picture a Scientist, in which one of the scholars, I don't know if she was an anthropologist or political scientist, but she had a classroom of students that she was asking to very quickly sort of categorize particular terms and concepts, associating them with maleness, femaleness, home, sort of job, whatever. And if in the initial run, the sort of stereotypical gender associations were up there on the screen. And as she was like putting the words up there, they had to say left, right. It went very fast. They had no problems thinking about it. And then she had them reverse it, where effectively they had to sort of take the term that showed up and disassociate it from the sort of stereotypical gender association. And they couldn't do it. I mean, it was incredibly, everything slowed down. They were all sort of all over the place in terms of how they responded. So it illustrated very clearly how difficult it actually is to decouple the way that we view this particular very important categorization system as a natural thing. And, so I do think that's, I think it's an exercise that has to be engaged in, but I also don't minimize the difficulty of it.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
And now it's Anastasia, and then Natalia, and then Alec.
Yes, Professor Arnold, thank you very much for this presentation. In Minoan archaeology, there is also a lot of gender-biased interpretations regarding architecture. And unfortunately, I don't know, graves in Minoan Crete were communal, so it's very difficult to make the distinction between male and female burials. It's a completely different situation. However, we do that in architecture, and for example, the Edwardian and Victorian architecture is imposed on our finds. And there are many characteristic examples from what we call Minoan villas to the palaces, what we call palaces, where some specific parts of a building is interpreted as the men's apartments, and other specific parts of the building are interpreted as the women's apartments. And that's completely insubstantial, and there is no base, there are no data to support such interpretations. Only Louise Hitchcock has tried to doubt these interpretations, and she has accepted a lot of critique, but she's completely right, and no one else has tried after her to repeat and insist on doubting this kind of gender-biased interpretations. We live in patriarchal societies, but we need a wider way of thinking, stay on the data, on the contextual analysis of the data. And thank you very much again for the presentation.
No, thank you. I absolutely agree, though. I think that this is not something that's, I should have mentioned that, it's not something that you only see in mortuary studies, obviously. So yes, it actually is pervasive. And I do feel that, particularly because it has the potential to really make archaeology relevant in a way that's actually, I think, productive and a little bit more maybe easy to demonstrate for the general public. It's an important sort of element and should probably be discussed more than it has been, particularly in these, when you have the opportunity, that the media are actually talking to you about this kind of topic. It's really critical to just use that moment to open that lens, exactly what you were just talking about.
And now it's Natalia's turn.
I wanted to ask Professor whether you think, you said at one point that maybe you think that it's not wise to fight the current and contemporary battles through archaeology. Of course, I agree. But I was wondering, what do you think, whether should we use those possible situations and contexts in archaeology to fight current female and feminist issues and fights in contemporary society? Particularly, I was referring to one quote that Professor Howard Williams talked about when he was presenting about Sutton Hoo chambers and grave goods. He said, "Dare to think it was here, the grave, it was a woman." So I was just wondering how beneficial could it be to do those thoughts experiments at least, and maybe to reinforce possibilities to think differently, just as a representation, no matter which part of your career position you're in.
I agree. I think it's critical, actually. I mean, it isn't necessarily always all that risky either. It depends a little bit on the context. So I don't want to make it sound as though, you know, you have to be somehow concerned about backlash, although it depends again on the context, obviously. I mean, I think this question now has come up several times, and we might consider it one of the themes. You know, on the one hand, we have, you know, what we've now multiple times referred to as the illusion of intellectual neutrality, and on the other hand, there's the sort of public intellectual, you know, kind of model, the idea that archaeologists should also be advocates. And I don't want to say that it's either one or the other necessarily, because clearly we are functioning in a realm that we've also all pretty much agreed is political, no matter what we're doing, even if it doesn't seem immediately obvious how that might manifest itself. But this is one of those areas where I have actually taken a stand, because I do feel it's important, and pointing out, you know, the fact that our particular views of gender in society today, although that's changing obviously slowly, is actually only a subset of the possible ways that gender was configured in previous societies and other contexts. I mean, the full spectrum is not represented in contemporary context generally, which doesn't necessarily mean that all of the archaeological contexts we study would manifest those, but the fact that they're there in the ethnographic record in you know, kind of a much broader sort of spectrum of manifestations means we need to consider that as a possibility.
Thank you.
Yep.
And Alec.
Yes, thank you for the beautiful lecture. It seems to me that some archaeologists have problems with interpretation of gender because they believe things were better in the past in some important aspects. One time I had a discussion with one of my colleagues about the significance of an earring found in a grave, and a young man entered our office and he had an earring. So I said to him, look, he's a man, he has an earring. Well, things were different in the past. It's not relevant.
Yeah.
That might have a contribution to the current state.
No, I agree.
Understanding of gender.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, the immediate dismissal of that possibility is obviously just as problematic. And in fact, it's worth pointing out as well that, you know, you do run into, as an archaeologist periodically, people who are part of sort of neo-pagan movements or, I mean, back in the 1990s in particular, there was a book called The Chalice and the Blade that was a popular bestseller in the United States by a non-archaeologist called Rianne Eisler. There's Maria Gimbutas's work, you know, and sort of the way that that's been interpreted through what's happening at Çatalhöyük. You can come up with a number of examples. And when you're in that situation where you're talking, let's say, to a group of, you know, members of the public, you have to be very careful because, again, this idea that a matriarchal society might have existed at some point in the past, that people have sort of created this vision of the past as a utopia, for women, a safe space that must have existed before, and trying to reclaim that in some way keeps them sort of, makes them feel more hopeful. And you have to find some way of, if you're going to take that away from them, you need to replace it with something that allows them still a little bit of agency with respect to choosing a way of thinking about these issues. So it can be difficult. I actually didn't have to do that once in a bookstore reading. Not an easy situation, I have to say. What I did was I brought reading lists for people. I said, I understand you all really love the chalice and the blade. This is why the archaeological evidence doesn't support most of it. Here are things that you can read that actually are just as interesting and will provide you with similar information, except it's based on actual data. So, I mean, it's whether that actually made a difference to any of them. They didn't throw anything at me, so I obviously must have done okay. But that was the one time I was in a situation where it sort of potentially could have gotten complicated. So I do think that, the dynamic there is it can be difficult to navigate.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Right. On a lighter note, I don't know if you are aware that the Vix crater is also part of the grand Greek nationalist narrative, obviously, because it was exported from Greece, Laconia, perhaps, to be buried with the princess of the Celts. And
yes,
I think that the word princess comes up every time we teach this in our classes, even now.
That use of some of that terminology is equally problematic.
It is.
I mean,
I don't want to open my book on Greek art because I'm sure I'm going to find it there. But next time I will teach this, I will mention the transvestite scenario, which I find extremely interesting.
Yeah, I'll send around an article that you could use for that if you're interested. But there's actually going to be there's a volume coming out that was part of a conference at Châtillon-sur-Seine where I've kind of gone back and looked at some of my initial thoughts about that grave, and the entire volume focuses on issues related to this topic. So it should actually be quite interesting.
Nice, thank you. Anything else? Any other questions? I think we've exhausted. Well, the subject is never exhausted, but perhaps we have exhausted our speaker.
Or ourselves.
So thank you everybody for another very productive day. I think. I'm sure Alec is also happy with today's proceedings. And we thank you. We both thank you all, and see you tomorrow. We start at 11 again, right? With Professor Tziovas. Okay. So, bye.
Bye. Goodbye.
Rest well.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.